Mic check. 1, 2, 3, 4. Mic check. 4, 3, 2, 1.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. Good. All right.
Myself. There we go. Committee will come to order. Good morning and welcome to the first of our public witness hearings dedicated to American Indians and Alaska Native programs. On a personal note, I'm thrilled to return as chairman of the Interior Subcommittee. It's back to the future again for me, but I'm proud to be here for the 118th Congress. The critical issues of this subcommittee are near and dear to me and my home state of Idaho. I look forward to working with the ranking member Pingree to advance programs that help conserve and protect our nation's most critical natural, cultural, and environmental resources, and strengthen the committee's longstanding effort to increase federal commitment to honor our treaties and trust responsibilities to American Indians and Alaska Natives. I'm proud that our first hearing for fiscal year 2024 appropriations focuses on these very important tribal programs. Indian country has been and will continue to be a bipartisan priority of this subcommittee. I also want to welcome all of the distinguished tribal elders and leaders here today. Thank all of you of our witnesses for appearing before the committee and sharing your concerns and personal perspective on these important topics. In terms of hearing logistics, I will call each panel of witnesses to the table, one panel at a time. Each witness will have 5 minutes to present testimony. Your full written testimony will be included in the record, so please don't feel pressured to cover everything in 5 minutes. We will be using a timer to track the progress of each witness. When the light turns orange, the witness will have 1 minute remaining to conclude his or her remarks. When the light turns red, I will ask the witness to stop. And please don't feel offended if I do that. We have to keep it to 5 minutes in order to get through all of the different witnesses that we're going to have. I think in the 2 days we have how many? 60, over 65 tribes that are going to testify before us, and so to keep it on schedule, I will tap the gavel at 5 minutes and stuff, so I appreciate that. We'll hear from every witness on each panel before members will be provided an opportunity to ask questions. Because we have a full day ahead, I request that we try to keep things moving in order to stay on schedule and respect each other's time. I also want to note that committee rules prohibit the use of outside cameras and audio equipment during these hearings. The hearings can be viewed in its entirety on the committee's website, and an official hearing transcript will be available at gpo.gov. With that, I thank you all for being here today, and I'm happy to yield now to our distinguished ranking member for any remarks she may wish to make.
Thank you very much, Chairman Simpson. I'm very excited to be here with you today, and congratulations on your return as chair of the committee. I know we're going to have a lot of areas of interest that we want to work together on, and this today is one in particular. So thank you for organizing and holding this hearing. I echo all of the chair's remarks. I appreciate all of you taking the time to come all the way to Washington. It's wonderful to be back in the committee hearing room again, but I know for many of you it's a challenge to travel all the way here, and so thank you for doing that. I look forward to hearing from you, look forward to hearing one of our chiefs from Maine, who's also the president of USET, and always delivers a lot of important issues to us about the tribal issues in my state, but so many apply to many of you. I particularly enjoy these hearings. I hear we have over 65 different tribal witnesses, and each of you bring unique challenges, unique areas of interest, and I always learn so much. So I'll be a good listener today. Look forward to hearing from all of you. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for having this hearing. And with that, I'll look forward to getting us started.
Thank you, and I do appreciate your comments, and I would like to say that ranking member Pingree has been chairman of this committee for the last 2 years, was it, or 4 years?
Might have been 4.
4 years. She's done a fantastic job, and I've always enjoyed working with her, and this committee is one of those committees that actually works in kind of a bipartisan fashion, particularly on Indian issues and stuff. So we will continue that, trying to make sure that we meet our treaty and obligations that we have. So I'll call the first panel up to the table. Larry Wright, Jr., Executive Director of the National Congress of American Indians. Tiza Zentek, the National Indian Education Association. Lori Hopper, Board President of the Tribal Education Department's National Assembly. And Tom Miller, Board President, the Association of Community Tribal Schools. Welcome, and thank you all for coming. Larry, you have the floor. Please pull that microphone toward you and just jerk it toward you. And turn it on by pushing till the green light's on.
We're on. Can you hear me? Yep. All right. Good morning. My name is Larry Wright Jr. I'm the Executive Director for, I guess that works better. I'm the Executive Director for National Congress of American Indians. I also served 11 years as Tribal Chairman for the Ponca Tribe in Nebraska. On behalf of the National Congress of American Indians, thank you for this opportunity to provide testimony on FY 2024 funding for the Department of Interior, the Indian Health Service, and the Environmental Protection Agency. The funding requests in NCAI's written and oral testimony are rooted in the promises made by the U.S. government in treaties and agreements with tribal nations. The 2018 Broken Promises Report from the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights found that federal funding for Native American programs across the government remains grossly inadequate to meet the most basic needs the federal government is obligated to provide. Congress and the administration have recently taken some initial meaningful steps toward making good on the federal government's promises to tribal nations. However, there is much more to be done by the federal government to truly fulfill the promises made to tribal nations. The BIA is one of the primary agencies responsible for providing services throughout Indian country, either directly or through compacts or contracts with tribal nations. The operation of these programs and services is essential for the health, safety, and social and economic well-being of tribal and surrounding communities. Unfortunately, chronic underfunding of tribal programs perpetuates systemic issues in Indian country that could be reduced or eliminated by funding tribal programs in amounts that meet the federal government's treaty and trust obligations to the tribal nations. NCAI recommends nearly $20.7 billion for Indian Affairs programs in FY 2024, consistent with the official FY 2024 recommendation of the Tribal Interior Budget Council. Specifically, this request includes funding increases necessary for the public safety on tribal lands. The inadequate funding for tribal criminal justice and public safety has resulted in staggering rates of violent crime and victimization on many Indian reservations. As just one example, a DOJ study recently found that more than 4 in 5 American Indian and Alaska Native adults have experienced some form of violence in their lifetime. The underfunding of tribal law enforcement and justice systems is well documented and contributes to these types of statistics. Empowering tribal nations and tribal justice systems to end this cycle of violence is critical, which is why NCAI appreciates Congress's reenactment of the Violence Against Women, the Reauthorization Act of 2022. VAWA has made our community safer and will continue to do so, and only if robust funding for VAWA-related programs, tribal police departments, and justice systems occurs. That is why NCAI supports $2.924 billion for public safety and justice funding, with approximately $1.766 billion for BIA law enforcement and $1.155 billion for tribal courts. As place-based peoples, tribal nations have sacred histories and maintain cultural practices that tie them to their current land bases and ancestral territories. As a result, tribal people directly and often disproportionately suffer from the impacts of environmental degradation. For that reason and others laid out in our written testimony, NCAI recommends $100 million to be appropriated for the EPA Tribal General Assistance Program and $30 million for the Tribal Air Quality Management Program. It is no secret that the Indian Health Service is chronically underfunded. It is estimated that the full IHS funding, need-based funding aggregate cost estimate for FY 2024 is approximately $51.4 billion. NCAI supports full funding for IHS and strongly urges Congress to ensure IHS funding is provided as mandatory spending, with a mechanism to automatically adjust spending to keep pace with population growth, inflation, and healthcare costs. Until such time that IHS has provided mandatory direct appropriations, advance appropriations for the IHS is consistent with the trust and treaty obligations reaffirmed by the United States in the Indian Health Care Improvement Act. And while NCAI applauds the advance appropriation enacted in the FY 2023 Omnibus Bill, adjustments need to be made moving forward to account, at a minimum, for fixed costs and staffing of newly completed facilities. Finally, I want to be clear, relative to the overall U.S. budget, the Indian Affairs and IHS budgets are very small. Spending cuts or other budget control measures that affect tribal programs can have devastating impacts on tribal nations and their citizens, but would have little impact on the overall spending, federal spending. To the extent Congress considers funding reductions in FY 2024, programs for the benefit of tribal nations, including those mentioned here today, must be held harmless. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Thank you, Larry. Tisa, you're next. Is that is it Tisa?
Tasha.
Tasha, okay.
All right, miigwech. Bojo, Tasha Zentek and Dejanakas, Anishinaabe and Dao. On behalf of the National Indian Education Association, the oldest and most inclusive organization founded to advance comprehensive, culture-based educational opportunities for American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians, miigwech for this opportunity to provide testimony on fiscal year 2024 funding for the Department of the Interior, the Bureau of Indian Education, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The spending within this subcommittee's jurisdiction is some of the most critical for Native youth. The fiscal year 2023 budget demonstrated an intentional effort to uphold the promises made to our people in exchange for life and land by ensuring funding levels for BIE-funded and BIE-operated schools not only met inflation rates, but increased towards reversing decades of underfunding. We urge the subcommittee to maintain this trajectory so Native students will have access to the resources they need to thrive in a global economy. As tribal nations represent central economic engines for many rural areas in the U.S., it only makes sense for this subcommittee to maximize your investment by providing critical resources for our Native youth. Tribal communities are unique in that even during times of economic downturn, Natives frequently remain in their traditional communities. To give tribal nations the necessary foundation for economic success and prosperity, the federal government should support a culturally relevant, high-quality education for all Native students that uplifts community-based approaches to education. The core funding for BIE elementary and secondary schools comes from the Indian School Equalization Program. These funds cover salaries for teachers, aides, principals, and other personnel, but are often reallocated to cover the program cuts in other areas of education. For ISEP, we are requesting $532.6 million, but we also would highlight the official Tribal Interior Budget Council recommendation of $967 million, which represents the minimum funding needed to offer a parity investment with public schools across the country. NIEA also requests $109 million for BIE facilities operations and $100 million for BIE facilities maintenance. BIE schools use operations and maintenance funding to cover such costs as electricity, heating fuels, and other operating expenses for both preventative and routine upkeep. Underfunding of maintenance continues to be an issue as a number of buildings are in poor condition and cannot maintain proper standards. NIEA strongly urges the subcommittee to increase the amount of funding for BIE education construction. We request $371.2 million for FY 2024, even though the need is much greater. Interior has estimated that more than $639 million would be needed to fix only the most pressing deferred maintenance issues for BIE schools. NIEA requests $23.8 million for the Johnson O'Malley program to assist with the unique educational needs of the other 93% of Native students in public schools. JOM programs provide critical educational resources for after-school programs, academic support, and a number of other Native cultural and language enrichment. JOM is supported by its parent committees that determine the needs of Native students in their communities. Tribal education departments and agencies are responsible for administering and implementing education priorities of tribal nations and are equal partners with state and federal education entities serving Native students. However, as tribal nations lack parity with states, local governments, and the federal government within the tax code, TEDs and TEAs do not receive tax revenue to fund their programs. Instead, TEDs and TEAs use tribal education department funding under BIE. NIEA requests $5 million for this account. There is a direct link between cultural identity and the cognitive success of Native students. It is critical to our communities that fight harder than ever to protect our Native languages. NIEA requests $25 million for language immersion grants for BIE schools. These grants allow tribal communities the ability to protect and preserve their unique cultural and linguistic heritages. NIEA also requests $25 million for Native language revitalization under Interior Economic Development to provide funding for tribally run Native language programs, ensuring students have language and cultural instruction available to them regardless of which school they may attend. In fiscal year 2023, this subcommittee and the rest of Congress made a major step towards fully upholding its trust obligations by providing mandatory spending for the Indian Health Service. If healthcare is a major pillar in upholding the federal trust obligation to tribal nations, then immediately next to it is the obligation for Indian education. NIEA strongly recommends all of Indian education be provided for as mandatory spending. This ensures there is never a threat of funding halts during critical times, and never will a crumbling school facility worry about if construction dollars will continue to come. The federal trust responsibility to all Native students is an example of the promises that makes this country unique. This subcommittee should honor its first promises and support the above recommendations to provide only the highest quality education to Native students across the country and provide the essential supports for future of our communities. Miigwech. Thank you.
Thank you. Lori?
Chairman Simpson, Ranking Member Pingree, and members of the committee. My name is Lori Harper, and I'm the president. Is this on?
Yeah, it's on.
And I'm the president of the Tribal Education Department's National Assembly, a national nonprofit organization for the tribal education departments and agencies. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today about funding through the U.S. Department of Interior for TEDS. First and foremost, our sincerest gratitude for appropriating funds continually since fiscal year 2015 to support TEDS through Title 25 United States Code Section 2020, also known as Section 2020 grants. For continued and increased funding, TEDNA respectfully requests $10 million to support TEDS in the Department of the Interior, Environment, and Related Agencies Appropriations Bill for fiscal year 2024 so that we can continue to serve and serve better our students. Tribes have educated their citizens from time immemorial, and education continues to be a tribal sovereign right, a trust obligation, an issue of local control, and a sacred responsibility of tribal and non-tribal governments that we have trusted as memorialized in treaties and other official sovereign and inter-sovereign acts, a part of the formal education of our students to the federal government via BIE-funded schools and states via public schools speaks to our expectation of the federal and state governments to honor their end of the bargains and promises made. And we should all be concerned. Educational attainment rates for tribal students in the United States today are not good. Recent federal reports show that our students have the lowest high school graduation rates of any group for whom numbers are maintained. While the high school graduation rates of whites, Asians, blacks, and Hispanics are at 80% or higher, 1 in 4 of our students will not graduate from high school. Federal funding precipitates the abilities of TEDS to help address this. TEDS are in a unique position to direct and coordinate the resources, management, and provision of education for tribal students. For example, I serve as the Director of Education for Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe in Minnesota, a Section 2020 grantee, and a TEDNA member. The tribe is developing a program under Section 2020 to address our inherent authority over all areas of education. I served as the board chairwoman for the tribally operated Buganagijic BIE-funded school. I am the director of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe's Tribal Ed Department, which administers Johnson O'Malley funds for public schools on and near our reservation. With Section 2020 grants, we have taken a community-based approach to improving education, utilizing community and youth input to shape priorities that will be developed into a tribal education code and a comprehensive education plan that will be culturally specific to our tribal needs. We also realize the importance of data sovereignty and have recently partnered with the Minnesota Department of Education on a data sharing agreement for our K-12 students, in addition to a longitudinal early childhood study. Through these agreements, we can both identify our students in early childhood and follow them through their educational journey within the state of Minnesota. The Section 2020 grant has been a catalyst for Leech Lake's involvement in areas beyond its grant and is making sovereignty in education a reality. Many more tribes than the 16 currently funded serve the 183 BIE-funded elementary and secondary schools and dormitories located across the country. They need TED funding. TED appropriations should be increased to serve more tribes and more students. With increased Section 2020 funding, tribes like the Pyramid Lake Paiute in Nevada, for example, could develop a TED to support Pyramid Lake Junior Senior High School, a tribal secondary school in Nixon, Nevada, on the Pyramid Lake Indian Reservation. With increased Section 2020 funding, tribes like the Navajo Nation, where many BIE-funded schools are located, could train new school board members when the schools convert from being BIE-operated to being tribally controlled. With increased Section 2020 funding, additional tribes could decrease their dropout rates, like the Rosebud Sioux Tribe in South Dakota did with its truancy intervention program administered by the Rosebud TED. TED now respectfully requests sustained funding of $5,889,000 plus additional funding for a total of $10 million for TEDs in the Department of the Interior, Environment, and Related Agencies Appropriations Bill for fiscal year 2024 to continue the vital and excellent work being done through the Section 2020 grants. Miigwech Bizintawig.
Thank you. Tom?
Morning. I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to testify on the 24 Interior Appropriations. There we go. It works this time. All right. And again, my name is Tom Miller. I'm the Association of Community Tribal Schools Board President. We formed in 1982. We represent a pretty good cross-section of the tribally controlled schools, and the organization has been around long enough that we went through 3 name changes, basically contract, controlled, and now community tribal schools. And we represent each year a variety of the schools, but the needs are always the same. I'm not going to get into the actual particulars of the dollar amount because they are in the written testimony, but we are running into many, many problems now as a result of our recent COVID pandemic. Our population has underlying health programs, a large percentage of them, and affect us in a disproportionate amount. We have isolation factors. Our schools are not next door to a Walmart or in that area. We don't have that luxury with many of them. Many of our schools do not have the internet connections. We've had problems as we've come into trying to get out of this separation distance learning thing, is that we couldn't do it in the first place because of our lack of technologies and such. We each year come in and we ask for the basics. We ask for increases in ISEP. We ask for increases in transportation, facility operation and maintenance, tribal grant support. And this is to get us holding ourselves even with the water. We're not going under this way. What we'd like to start doing is that we'd like to see some kind of parity. And one of our ideas that, now when I started this, I had all my hair, it was black, 1980, I believe it was there. But right now we're looking at, we're trying to get a parity with the Department of Defense schools on salaries and school construction. One of our problems is not only do we have a problem of getting teacher shortage. Oh, it's 3 times as bad on the reservations because first off, you have to recruit, retain. So when I say about the dollars that I'm going to address right here are those in addition to our testimony. That is getting Congress to either forward fund some of our areas, maybe all of our areas that we get funding in, so that we're not in the ping pong effect of politics. We try to get out of that. We did it once in '88. It took a little bit of a sting then with Congress to forward fund a full year. Some of that would take another sting. The other big sting would be for facilities. I don't care what you do. If you take old schools and maintain them, you have an old school maintained. That's all you get. Our thing is, if Congress were to plan, use a $3 billion base, take the schools, the 83 that need replacing right now, we're doing 2 a year. I'll be dead and long gone by the time these schools get addressed. And I'm just trying to get, our students deserve the same thing that has been done with DOD. That is over 10 years, a couple $1 billion, bring them up, you have added, and they should be supported. The military and those schools should absolutely be supported. But so should we. And we've been at this. In fact, the last time I testified in front of this committee, about 6 years ago, I told the chair at that time that I could probably have recorded this in 1980 and play the same thing again and come pretty close. But that's where we're getting now. We're trying to get to a point where not only do we get the funding that we normally get in a year, and that varies on the percentages, but we have to address some of these things in a drastic method because it's not getting any better for our kids. And our Native students deserve to have enough teachers to teach. They need to have enough money to operate, and they certainly deserve the ability to have a safe and adequate, up-to-date environment, school building. So that's where we're pushing this year. That if we could get that started, we know it's not a one-time shot and it's going to happen overnight, but we've got to start somewhere. And we had to this point, we've always been settled with our yearly increases. Last year, I'd like to thank for the FY23 was good, but we'd like to see that every year. And again, forward funding would take care of a lot of the problems and the instability of when the money's coming. And then if you give us a good house to live in, it's a little bit easier to make things happen. Those kids deserve that. And with that, I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate all of your testimony. Let me just say, keep pushing, Tom. I know it sometimes takes Congress a long time to do things, you know, and that's generally the way we operate around here. But but it's something that we need people like you to continue to push on that. People like all of you. Larry, you mentioned law enforcement and the challenges you face. Do you find that? Well, let me put it this way. I was out at the Fort Hall Reservation and talking with them about firefighters and new fire station we're building and the police officers that were there and stuff. And what we find is that we got a town of 50,000 on the south of Fort Hall Reservation and a town of 10,000 on the north of the reservation. And the reservation police officers, they send them to training. They come, they get all trained up, and as soon as they do, they get hired by Pocatello or Blackfoot, and I mean, it's like the training ground for the other communities. You find that across the country, or is this unique?
No, I think it is across the country, and when you compound that with some reservations are bigger than many states,
Yeah.
and you have a police force that's a fraction of that,
Yep.
and lack of funding to make it so that you can train and retain police force, it makes it very difficult. And just like teachers, they're going to go where there's opportunity and salary that's reflective of what they do and their training and education, and police departments are no different.
Yeah, reservations. A lot of the reservations are very big, and when I've talked to some, I can't remember if it was Pine Ridge or that they get a call of domestic abuse. It's an hour before a police officer can get there.
Absolutely.
Well, you know, the problem's gone away one way or another then, pretty much. That is a challenge. It's something I'd like to work with you on and how we address. I don't know how to address it, but it's something that I think needs to be addressed. And Tisa, I appreciate your testimony. And Tom mentioned the difficulty of finding teachers. And how do you keep teachers on the reservation? I mean, when we've gone to the Navajo reservation and stuff, the problem is housing. Trying to get doctors there and to stay on the reservation. I mean, you don't want to live 50 miles from where you work, and that's a challenge. How do you do that with teachers?
Absolutely. Housing is a major concern. So providing, we're looking for funding for housing for teachers. Also, of course, as mentioned with law enforcement, the pay is a huge issue. If teachers are able to get paid elsewhere and in more, where the living is more convenient, then they are likely to do that. So funding, increased funding for teacher pay to get that equal to federal teaching
Yeah.
pay, as well as housing, would help with that issue quite a bit. Also, programs to help grow your own teachers is extremely helpful. Then, if teachers decide to stay in their own communities, they might be more likely to stay for a long time.
Do you work at all with TRIO?
I do a little bit in my my job as the education director for the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, partner with some of our local community colleges.
I'd encourage all of you to start working with TRIO because TRIO can be a great asset in what they do. That's for people that have never gone to college, never thought of going to college or anything like that, but it helps mentor them through high school to get them ready if they decide they want to go to college. Ranking Member Pingree.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, everyone, for your testimony. Really appreciated all the themes, and I know we'll hear them more today, certainly the law enforcement, and your statistic about 4 in 5 members of a tribe have had some form of violence in their family or themselves. That's really shocking, and another reminder of how important it is to fund tribal courts. And as you mentioned, the distance in so many of our communities is so far. That's really critical. And I've worked with one of my schools on school replacement and seen just what a challenge is in, one tiny school, one state, and realize if we could just get rid of the backlog at some point, as you recommended, and start we're never going to get there. And I really appreciated your remarks that, kids need to have the feeling of the respect of going into a beautiful building that's dedicated to them and they can comfortably learn. And so I just want to say how dedicated I am to that, and really appreciated the remarks about culturally sensitive education. I think the more we can support, kids understanding a native language and learning more about the history of their tribes, when I've been able to witness those programs, they just seem so beneficial, and I hope we can continue to do more of that. And of course, I'm fully supportive of all the funding concerns. We're so far behind, do not meet our treaty obligations. It's so disrespectful of the lack of funding that our tribes receive in each and every area that you mentioned. So I hope we can do everything to make sure there are no cuts and that we can increase that. And while Betty is the true Minnesotan here, I was raised in Minnesota and spent a lot of my childhood in one of the lakes near Brainerd, so still go back there to visit my family. So love the place you're from. I don't have any questions because you just all did such a wonderful job, and the chair's asked some good questions, but thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Mr. Zinke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for being late. I had a Montana coffee, so. Drugs. So on the law enforcement and drugs in Montana seems to be, they spend a lot of time on drugs, mental health, and civil action, mostly domestic violence. And what I understand is all three are related, oftentimes. Can you talk about the drug problem on the reservations, what you're seeing? And my understanding is in Montana, most of it's coming from the southern gut. It's coming straight up from the border. And in Montana, we have Fort Peck Reservation, which is near the Bakken. Many times, great expanses of territory means that there's opportunity for storage lockers of drugs and transportation, and there's a vulnerable population. So how concerned are you on drugs on the reservation?
Indian country is very concerned, and we see this across the board, and fentanyl is a big issue. And I think the things that you hear today, they're all interconnected, and one begets the other. When we have lack of law enforcement, it's going to be hard to, if you have a reservation that has high crime and drug issues and doesn't have the police force to help police that and take care of that, it's going to be hard to retain good teachers to come to the reservation and live there. If we don't have adequate housing, we can't recruit and keep our own people on reservations. And so when we have underfunding in our housing programs and we have our own wait lists for our own tribal citizens to get into housing, it's going to be hard to recruit people to come from the outside to do that. But I think to your specific question on drug issues in Indian country, with the distance and the geographic size of our reservations, lack of cross-deputization, those kinds of issues, it makes it very tough for a small police force to cover that expanse and not have some of the same equipment and different things, opportunities that other law enforcement agencies have, whether it be drug dogs, whatever that might look like. But I think we're seeing it more and more. It's more of a concern. But again, there's lack of funding and lack of the infrastructure there from police departments to help to adequately address that.
And Tom, I'm not going to hold you to the statistic, but would you say that the law enforcement spends most of their time on either drug enforcement or mental health that are related? That's what I'm hearing, and
I'd say
across the
a
board.
good portion, but I don't, the exacts, not expert enough. I would say this, as far as in our area, which Sault Ste. Marie with the Chippewa tribe, recently, just 2 weeks ago, we had about 5 overdose, 1 died, and that was in a week. So it's a problem, and we address it as best we can. But one of the major things that we're short of, funding. That you can see a problem, but you can't do anything about it if you don't have the people to do it, and we don't have the people to do it.
And lastly, inflation. What I've seen across in Montana, inflation runs higher because you have, distances are further, the fuel costs are further, bus, to get the kids around, it costs more because we're using more fuel, and inflation. Would you say that inflation is hurting the tribes disproportionately?
I would say that, yeah, because we're short already. The fact is, if you're doing well and you're getting inflation, you can kind of adjust to it. But if you're already on the short end and inflation comes out, it can hurt you. Hopefully things will get better. I'm kind of an optimist, but I think right now, yeah, it hurts everybody in the tribes that don't have the money, and there are some that are set fairly well, are handling it a lot better than those that aren't. It definitely is a little bit, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First and foremost, thank you for your testimony. For those of you who are going to testify later, I'm the ranking member on defense, and so I have a conflict and I have to be there, but I have staff here getting the testimony. The mandatory funding, we hear Indian Country loud and clear on that. The advanced appropriations is for 1 year only, so that's going to have to be re-rolled into any legislation that we do. And that was a bipartisan effort on behalf of this committee and the White House, and we got the Senate's attention. So hopefully we can take care of health care and start and really have a serious discussion about what we could do for educational funding this year. So I appreciate you bringing that up. I also bringing up that there's 2 accounts that you're looking for $25 million for the languages was very helpful. So thank you for that. That made me take an extra note on that. I'm going to just make a couple of general comments, and then I have a question for you all, because I think you're all impacted by this. We're going to hear more about, I think, drugs and what's happening, especially with tribes that are in 280. We just had a serious discussion with our U.S. Attorney Andy Lugar has been meeting and talking with the tribes in Minnesota what we can do about, as they describe it, catch and release. And there's no other way to summarize what's happening. So I'll save that for later, and been working with Red Lake on that. But Minnesota, if you could take a second to talk about what Minnesota is uniquely doing, even to make sure that all of our students have the best education possible. And under the leadership of Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, this has taken a real emphasis. And I think the fact that we have tribally enrolled members serving in our state legislative bodies exciting. If you just take a second for that, and then I have a general question about broadband.
So a real quick question with having Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan in that seat, what it has helped tribal nations do in the state of Minnesota in education specific is identify the need for us to be at the table instead of on the table. And it's opened up discussions that include us, and it's not uncommon for not just the governor's office and the lieutenant governor's office to reach out to tribal leaders, but also to tribal department heads such as myself, to be asked for our specifics in the field of education. In my role as an education director, I also oversee human services, so MFIP, SNAP Ed, so Minnesota Family Investment Program, anything having to do with training and education. So a lot of in Indian country, a lot of our responsibilities are intertwined throughout various funding agencies.
Thank you. Well, we've started a journey, and we hope other states emulate that. And it's important that we educate students because they're our future, not only for the tribe but for the nation. And the department. And as I'm leaving to go to a DoD hearing, the fact that Native Americans percentage-wise serve highest enlistment really makes a case for why we need to make sure that they have the adequate education. Mr. Chair, I know broadband's going to come up a lot. We need to figure out not only how to do it in the schools, but to get it in the home when they have the homework coming home. So thank you all for bringing up broadband.
May I go ahead, Sean?
Thank you, Mr. Cullen. Former chair of this committee. We've got on this committee 2 former chairs and 1 current chair that was a former chair.
Yeah,
So there's a lot of chairmen on this committee.
and we all work together.
Anyway, thank you. And thank you all for your testimony. We appreciate you being here today and look forward to working with you on this year's budget.
Thank you. I will get you that fixed, okay?
Next, we'd call, I'm I'm going to massacre names. Maybe that's the wrong word. How do you pronounce that? Do you know? The Muskogee Creek Nation, who's and Oliver Little Cook, chair of the Spokane tribe.
Where would you like us?
Are they gonna right up here? They got. We've got nameplates. Yeah, we got nameplates. Okay, pronounce that name for me.
Jonadav Chowdhury.
Chowdhury. Well, when you say it, that's what it looks like now. Thank you, Jonadav. You're up.
Oh, well, okay. Well, Mado, actually, Jonadav Chowdhury, I'm honored to serve as ambassador of the Muskogee Creek Nation. Chairman Simpson, Ranking Member Pimbry, and members of the subcommittee, let me thank you for the invitation to our nation to testify here today. Let me start by saying how grateful we all are for the additional funding this subcommittee has provided in the past 2 years as a down payment on the permanent commitment going forward by the federal government to provide the resources necessary to uphold its solemn trust and treaty obligations to the Muskogee Nation and other tribal nations throughout Indian country. As you know, over 100 years of usurpation of the rightful authority of the tribal law enforcement in Oklahoma reservations has left tribal nations with great needs for public safety infrastructure. As particularly the case with the Muskogee Creek Nation. As we implement restored jurisdiction, $80 million are required for the construction of 8 regional tribal jails on the reservation. And just a little background, our nation covers 8 full counties in eastern Oklahoma and parts of 3 more counties. It covers over 3.2 million acres with well over a million people within our borders. And we're doing our part to keep people safe, and we appreciate your support. Additionally, $80 million are required for the construction of 8 regional tribal courthouse facilities on the reservation. Like most jurisdictions, we've seen an explosion in criminal mental health cases and $27 million for the construction of 2 mental health facilities for the incarceration of individuals requiring mental health evaluation and treatment, both pretrial and post-conviction. Finally, $24 million are required for the construction of 4 juvenile detention facilities on the reservation that will appropriately separate young offenders from older, hardcore criminals, and to focus on the rehabilitation of youthful inmates. In addition to significant infrastructure needs, our current federal trust funding for ongoing operations is far below the rightful amounts. According to the BIA standards, the Muskogee Nation must maintain a police force of 312 full-time equivalents for our population size, law enforcement FTEs. This requires $34.4 million on a recurring basis for increased personnel, equipment, and other operational costs. Just as law enforcement needs have grown, so too have the needs of tribal courts. Using the BIA Office of Justice Services report, Creek Nation estimates that an additional $40 million is required to support expanded responsibilities for tribal courts. In FY20, Muskogee Nation's ICWA program provides services to more than 1,800 Indian children, placed an average of 253 Indian children in homes per month, and investigated 1,452 reports of child abuse and neglect, a six-fold increase in 5 years. We calculate that $30 million in additional funding will be needed to provide tribes in Oklahoma sufficient ICWA services. The Muskogee Creek Nation Center for Victim Services served 636 victims and survivors in 2022, 575 of which experienced VAWA-related crimes. Additional funding of $60 million would allow for the construction of facilities that would allow us to fully administer VAWA and protect our women and children from violence. And other governance needs, the nation performs a number of functions related to self-governance, and these functions have grown. One exciting area that I'd like to highlight is natural resources management. We're currently working with several members on legislation that would enable Muskogee Nation to bring cultural and historical management expertise in a co-management position with the National Park Service. We believe we can help NPS save taxpayer dollars while simultaneously improving the experience of park visitors. In closing, we greatly appreciate the opportunity to present these views of our needs to you as part of the FY23 appropriations process. Reaffirmation of the Muskogee Nation Reservation following the McGirt decision once again called our nations together to make decisions for the greater public good. We stand ready to assist in providing the core public safety services that will protect our reservation and the United States, Muskogee Nation citizens, and all our friends and neighbors living within our jurisdictions. We believe in prosperity for all, and we're doing our part. Again, we appreciate your support.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oliver?
Yes, sir.
Turn on the mic.
That on? Okay. All right. Yes, sir, Chairman Simpson and Member Pingree. My name is Oliver Little Cook. I'm the chairman of the Ponca Tribe of Oklahoma. And I'm glad to have this in front of me because listening to the other panel, they almost forgot what I was going to talk about today because I have the same concerns that they have also. But I'm here. I'm honored to submit a written statement to the subcommittee and testify in person. I'm a lifelong member of the Native American Church, which is a way of life that is also described as the peyote religion. And as a practitioner of this ceremony and a tribal leader, I am compelled to express to this committee that you also have a role in protection and perpetuation of the Native American Church, in the continuance of this religion and fulfillment of the 1978 American Indian Religious Freedom Act and the Policy Declaration, Public Law 95-341, is contingent upon the survival of the peyote habitat. Without sufficient peyote habitat, the peyote plant, which we call peyote, will no longer exist in the wild. The entire Native American Church ceremony is dependent on peyote, which is used as a sacrament. So what I'm here is requesting $5 million for a peyote habitat conservation initiative demonstration project. and we're in you might say, a crisis situation now because we have probably over 300,000, 400,000 members all across in the Indian country, and speaking of those of us at home in Oklahoma and my reservation, Ponca, it is getting more difficult to obtain peyote. And so it is really important that we find some way, we're asking you all for help in some way where we can initiate some type of a conservation project to work with the farmers and ranchers down in Texas so we can preserve it. And slow in here. To counteract the peyote habitat destruction, we requested $5 million for Peyote Habitat Initiative to establish a separately funded grant program within the U.S. Department of Interior and administered by the Department of Interior's Office of Assistant Secretary of Interior. And so the National Congress of American Indians recently passed Resolution 2209 affirming support for the American Indian Religious Freedom Act as amended and calling for federal preemption as it pertains to the legalization and or decriminalization of peyote. And this resolution was endorsed unanimously by members, tribes of NCAI. And again, you know, just personally speaking on behalf of my tribe, Ponca, when we were removed from our homeland, original homeland, up in Nebraska and South Dakota, and when we came to Oklahoma, and like most tribes, we were devastated with the move. You know, we had nothing left. You know, everything was taken away from us, and it's especially our way of life, our religious way of life, and so because of that, there was a lot of, you might say, turmoil within our tribe, no direction, and so when this peyote religion came to us, I would say it actually saved us, gave us all a sense of belonging, a sense of direction, and a sense of prayer, which changed our lives and continue. And so I myself am a lifelong member of this Native American church and has done wonders. My tribe was one of the 6 original tribes to incorporate in Oklahoma to make it into a church, and so now it is called Native American Church. So I represent all of our members in Oklahoma and speak for all of our members across the country who we really need this. So what we're asking of you is just a small lump compared to what the rest of the tribes that we're asking for. So we would really need your support and help in helping us save it. It needs to be saved. It's protected, but now it needs to be saved. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both for being here today. Just out of curiosity, what's I support the Native American Church, and just like I do any other religion. What's the natural habitat of growing peyote? I mean, like potatoes grow in Idaho, and outside of Idaho, there's a lot of tubers growing, but potatoes are growing in Idaho. So there's a certain climate for that kind of stuff, for Maine and Idaho and stuff.
Yes.
What's the climate like or habitat that peyote grows in?
It grows in southwest Texas. Right now, there's only probably 4 counties in southern Texas, and it's called it's a shrub brush deal. And so today, because of the ranchers and farmers, they're leasing out their land, and of course with windmill pads, and then also the climate change and all of that. So it's getting more scarce.
Yeah,
it's getting scarce, and so that's why we're requesting so we can try to do something to save it. Because our life, the way we see it, our life it depends on it.
Yeah,
and it's so we kind of might say all on pirate land because it's up to the ranchers. It's their land.
Yeah.
So we're trying to find a way to work with them.
Okay. Appreciate it. Thank you. Ms. Pingree?
Yes, thank you. Thank you both for your testimony, and I was curious about that too. Is peyote grown as a cultivated plant, or is it only? Are you saying it's just wild and native in those areas?
It's a native plant.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And it grows wild, and it has been destroyed all the way up to now. It's just condensed to maybe like say four counties.
Great. Well, I'm happy to learn more about that, and I appreciate your describing it as a small lump of money. That's a new technical term on the committee. And you're
Why
not-
in comparison, I guess.
Absolutely.
you might say,
No,
for
I mean, we
Nebraska.
talk a lot about big numbers, and
I
so.
think this would be a good start, a demonstration project, where we can work with them.
Great. I will,
let
yeah.
it grow into $100 million grant one day.
I'll be interested to learn more about that. So thank you for your testimony, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador. My partner is actually from Muskogee. He was born there and grew up in Gore. So I've spent a little time visiting Oklahoma, and last summer I got a chance to meet with the chiefs of the 5 civilized tribes and talk a little bit about McGirt. So I understand some of the unique challenges there, and particularly in the law enforcement. So thank you for bringing that to our attention, and happy to continue working with you because it's definitely some big challenges there. And you described the area and the need and the amount of funding. We really need to pay more attention.
And thank you, Ranking Member. Principal Chief, thank you, Ranking Member. Principal Chief Hill gives his regards. He is taken away on critical national business today, but he specifically mentioned that meeting, and we were very happy to host you when you came down, and we really appreciate you taking the time there. A little bit outside of the scope of today's discussion, but connected still is our ongoing efforts to implement McGirt in the face of kind of these countervailing cases that have come our way, including the Castro Huerta case. So we're in a point in history right now where we're trying to develop infrastructure that was denied to us for 100 years because of the unlawful exercise of non-tribal jurisdiction on our lands. We're very thankful that the court affirmed our reservation, but we're concerned that within a year after affirming, the very same court placed limitations on the inherent sovereignty of our tribe to exert jurisdiction on our lands, but by extension, the inherent sovereignty of tribal nations throughout the country. So our battles truly are Indian country battles. We appreciate the personal attention that you gave to these issues because they certainly impact the entire trust relationship between the federal government and tribal nations throughout the U.S. We, on a related note, we support a call for Congress to act and voice its support of tribal sovereignty in the wake of the Castro Huerta decision, because we think that's absolutely fundamental to supporting our efforts to protect people within our borders, be they native or non-native, and protect them both in the law enforcement arena, but also in the economic development arena. And so having Congress signal its support of tribal sovereignty, we think not only benefits Indian country, it benefits everybody in our borders. So thank you for the personal attention and time that you took to visit our nation.
Absolutely appreciated your hospitality, and we'll continue this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. I got to tell you, Tom Cole keeps us advised of everything that's going on in Oklahoma. So, a great member, a great friend. But I was just wondering, you mentioned in your testimony that law enforcement standards would be, you'd have 312, I think it was.
Yes, sir.
Law enforcement people. How many do you currently have?
Oh, I knew you'd ask me that.
I mean, you don't have to be exact. Is it even close?
I'm not. I want to say we've got a lot of cross-deputization agreements. I want to say we're well over 100 now. We're at 80 or so for a while, but I don't know if that sounds right.
Well, that's good enough. I just wondered if you were at 200 or 250 or 100,
We're getting there, but I mean, again, we've never been able to develop the infrastructure because of these complications created by kind of the unlawful exercise of non-tribal jurisdiction. Now that that's been affirmed, we're using our limited resources to the greatest extent possible to build up our law enforcement and courts and social workers, but we've got a long way to go. And we've been actively engaged in intergovernmental agreements since day one from the McGirt decision, but funding is always critical to those efforts.
Do you have issues with cross-deputization of tribal police officers?
Well, I think it depends on the county. As I said before, we cover 8 full counties and 3 partial counties, and Our relationships are very strong with a number of sheriff's offices and a number of counties, but I'm not going to throw anybody under the bus.
Yeah.
There are a couple counties that we could have better relationships with. And,
Okay.
you know, relationships are work, and,
Yep.
and we're committed to doing the work.
And when counties, what I found out in Idaho and other places is that when county elections come around, you get a new sheriff, sometimes that relationship goes good, sometimes it goes bad.
Well,
you know?
And that's an excellent point, and that's why the need to have permanent funding allocations is so critical, because a lot of the relationship breakdowns often, unfortunately, fall along political lines. Whether or not there's a political calculation to cooperating with the tribe or not, that shouldn't impact law enforcement concerns. It shouldn't impact funding concerns. So the idea of having permanent funding and you know, permanent appropriations is critical. So we, as I said before, and you mentioned Tom Cole, he's been a great advocate for McGirt-related funding, and you know, when I mentioned the initial down payment of this subcommittee towards law enforcement funding at the start, you know, Tom Cole was a champion of that. But that is just a major step forward to everything else that needs to be done. Our nation oh, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, it seems to me that everybody's testified so far, just 6. Everybody wants either, you know, forward funding, permanent funding, whatever for these programs. What you really all want is stability,
Absolutely.
to know what's going to happen. And that's really important. I wish we had stability here in Congress, but that doesn't always work. But anyway, listen, I appreciate your testimony and all that you guys do, and we'll work with you on these issues and try to address them. Try to move us forward.
Thank you, and I'm sorry for scaring off all the other chairs once we sat down. We had a full room of chairs, but they're all gone now.
Yeah, it's
But-
because they're chairs. And
There you go.
And they've got other committees that they have to step into, and a lot of them will step into them and come back. And so it's it's the way it works around here.
Yep.
Anyway, I appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Okay. Boo Nygren? Is that how you pronounce that? Oh, geez. Kirk, Kirk Francis and Frank Starr comes out.
Perfect. Good morning. Good morning, Chairman. I appreciate you extending the invitation to be here, and Ranking Member Pingree, it's good to see you again as well, and then the rest of the committee. Some of you might be listening, or some of you might be making your way this way. But first of all, I just wanted to start my testimony off with the Navajo Nation actually lost one of its iconic leaders last night, Dr. Peterson Zaw. He was the first president of the Navajo Nation, and I understand that he was a good champion here on the Hill in the 90s and the 80s. So that's a big loss for the Navajo Nation. I just wanted to let Indian country know as well, too. I know that he was a huge tribal advocate across Indian country and America. So thank you to his family for letting us, having him lead the Navajo Nation. But my name is Boo Nygren, president of the Navajo Nation. I'm honored to be here as the newly elected president of the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation is one of the largest tribes in the country, It provides critical services to over 400,000 members, half of whom reside on the reservation. The Navajo Nation spans 27,000 square miles across 11 counties in Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. Our nation has approximately 1/3 of the on-reservation Indian population in the United States. Indian health care, tragically, the Navajo Nation lost nearly 1% of its on-reservation population because of COVID. This is a high mortality rate, is directly connected to ongoing deficiencies in Indian health care because of limited funding. If further inroads are to be made to address this health care deficiency, this committee needs to boost IHS funding by a factor substantially greater than the inflation rate. The IHS received an advance funding for fiscal year 2024. This is a very important for planning purposes, but we ask that this committee support making advance appropriations for permanent for both the IHS and for the BIA. This is especially for critical programs and services such as public safety, housing, disaster relief, social services, welfare assistance, and self-governance. Assuring public safety. For every 1,000 Navajos, there are only 0.85 public safety officers. This is far below the FBI's recommendation of 3.5. With so few officers available, calls for services are delayed because of the distances between communities. From the law enforcement stations, the Navajo Nation requests an increase of $26 million for its public safety services. Protecting our children, the Navajo Nation's Indian Child Welfare Act program is critical to our ability to protect Navajo children and the future of the Navajo people. Unfortunately, Navajo ICWA has only 15 team members who must coordinate and collaborate with tribal, state, and federal partners in 24 states. With 354 active ICWA cases, including 655 Navajo children, current funding is less than $1.6 million. The Navajo Nation needs $5 million annually. Improving housing, the Navajo Nation asked for $23 million for BIA's Housing Improvement Program. This program provides much-needed housing resources to Indians residing in Indian country who cannot meet HUD's excessive program income thresholds. Abandoned uranium mine cleanup on the Navajo Nation. According to the EPA, more than half of over 523 abandoned uranium mine sites located on our nation lack federal funding for cleanup and monitoring. These sites are subject our members to substantial ongoing cancer and health risk. Approximately $5 billion is needed to address these sites. Fulfill federal obligations for Navajo Indian Irrigation Project. The Navajo Nation agreed to exchange water for a federal promise to build a Navajo Nation Indian Irrigation Project. However, approximately 35,000 acres of the promised farmland remains undeveloped. The Navajo Nation asks that the federal government finish its work, which will cost approximately $1 billion. Navajo relocation. The Office of Navajo and Hopi Indian Relocation was created to carry out the forced relocation of approximately 15,000 Navajos that began in 1978. This committee knows well the harm and trauma this relocation has caused to many people, as well as related multi-decade construction freezes imposed over 1.6 million acres of land. This harm is felt down onto the second and third generation of relocatee families. The Navajo Nation requests include an immediate transfer of $15 million in excess of ONER funds to the Navajo Rehabilitation Trust Fund, funding for the Navajo Thaw Initiative, funding for studies, analysis, and reports concerning Navajo relocation and the construction and repair freeze and their ongoing impact, support for Navajo technical amendments legislation that would authorize ONER to work with the former Bennett Freeze area. This would eventually lay the groundwork for closure of ONER in a humane fashion through a multi-agency program of rehabilitation put in place over the next 10 years. In conclusion, thank you for taking the time to consider the Navajo Nation's needs. We look forward to working with you all to enact the 2024 appropriations package.
Thank you. Kirk?
Good morning, Chairman Simpson, Ranking Member Pingree. It was great to see you as well, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony. My name is Kirk Francis. I serve as the president of the United South and Eastern Tribes Sovereignty Protection Fund. I'm also the chief of the Penobscot Indian Nation in the great state of Maine, where we have terrific potatoes, by the way, Mr. Simpson.
I like to tease a lot.
And so we are here today as an organization to continue to remind you all that the federal government is failing to deliver upon its obligations to tribal nations and Native people. This failure has persisted regardless of changes in administration or Congress, despite numerous reports, investigations, recommendations, and consistent advocacy from Indian country. It's been evident in the 2003 Quiet Crisis Report, the 2018 Broken Promises Report, and continues in spite of the recent funding allocated to tribal nations via the COVID-19 relief and infrastructure packages. This is not a question about addressing poverty and needs across Indian country. Our relationship with the United States is ultimately about honor and fulfillment of commitments and promises. The solutions we offer involve a fundamental shift in federal Indian policy and funding. They will allow Indian country to realize its great potential and create lasting, positive change for tribal nations and our people. With this in mind, we underscore the importance of continued increases for tribal lines in the federal budget. We recognize there may be plans and conversations to reduce discretionary spending and remind you all that deficit reduction must not be accomplished to the detriment of obligations to tribal nations. Deep and chronic failures require bold, systematic changes, some of which have recently been proposed under the administration. However, because these hearings are being held prior to the release of the President's request for FY24, we are unable to react to any specific proposals for this appropriation cycle in this testimony. We request the opportunity to provide additional written testimony to this body after the President's request is released, and that maybe you might consider holding a future hearing after that request is issued. It is critical that the administration propose and Congress demand budgets containing full funding for all federal Indian agencies and programs. Given our history and unique relationship, this funding can no longer be subject to the instability of discretionary spending. We extend our gratitude for the work of this subcommittee in achieving advanced appropriations for IHS. It is our expectation that this will be included in every appropriations bill going forward. In the long term, we must achieve full and mandatory funding for all federal Indian agencies and programs. The processes under which OMB develops budgets and policies that impact us require reform also. In concert with its newly established Tribal Affairs Advisor, OMB must be required to produce a full, detailed accounting of funding distributed to Indian country, including only what Indian nations have accessed, not funds for which we are technically eligible. Congress should also work with OMB to hold states accountable for any pass-through dollars that are intended for tribal nations. While we are appreciative of the inclusion of funding for tribal nations in the recently enacted infrastructure packages, this level of funding is insufficient to address centuries of unmet infrastructure obligations. A much greater federal investment is necessary to rebuild tribal nation infrastructure and economies, similar to the U.S. investment in rebuilding post-World War II Europe via the Marshall Plan. The legislative and executive branches should commit to the same investment to rebuild tribal nations. As we await details on the President's budget, we provide our regionally identified priorities for IHS and Department of Interior in our written testimony. We continue to support mandatory funding proposals for IHS, as well as the 105L and CSC lines of the IHS budget, BIA and BIE. We would also like to highlight the following additional priorities: payment in lieu of taxes for trust land acquisitions, increased funding for tribal historic preservation, interagency transfer authority for tribal funding, $80 million for the Native Behavioral Health Resource Program, and dedicated funds and permanency for the following: Treasury's Office of Tribal and Native Affairs, OMB's Tribal Advisor, and the White House Council on Native American Affairs. We now call upon Congress, and this subcommittee in particular, to work with tribal nations and the administration to fulfill the government's trust and treaty obligations through the federal budget. While each member of Congress shares equally in these obligations, you have a unique understanding of this charge, including the unmet funding obligations, and more importantly, the opportunity to drive historic change. In closing, we implore you to lead this change within Congress to improve how the United States views, honors, and fulfills its promises to Indian country. Thank you very much, sir.
Yes, good morning, Chairman, ranking members, and members of the subcommittee. I greet you all to a warm handshake. My name is Frank Starcomes-Out. I'm the current and newly elected president of the Oglala Sioux tribe. I'm also the newly elected chairman for the Great Plains Tribal Chairmen's Association. I'll be brief. A little bit about my history, and why I'm sitting here today is, I served in the United States Marine Corps, so I'm a proud veteran. I served in the Gulf War and in Mogadishu, Somalia, during my tour of duty as a machine gunner. And I truly believe, I've always been on boots on the ground from that day forward as a young man to this day. So I just want to mention that in my fight for my people, our people in Indian country. So with that, I also served as I started out as in the districts as serving my communities, and then now as a president of my tribe. And I come before you to urge you to fulfill your treaty responsibilities. We face a lot of challenges on our Pine Ridge Reservation. We have the lowest life expectancy in the entire United States, high unemployment, and lack of business development, just to name a couple. I could spend hours talking about issues, but I'll try to keep it under 5. We suffer a lot of challenges. Law enforcement, we're in dire need of manpower, equipment, resources to meet our challenges of gangs, violence, and drugs. Social services, we lack sufficient wages and housings to attract staff. We are short social workers. We lack the basic transitions to follow-up resources for reunification. Our youth need emergency shelters, counselors, nutrition, support, and services. Our healthcare, we have inadequate staffing, long wait times, and very few providers because of our geographical location and the situation on our reservation. Our BIA roads, we lack qualified personnel, equipment, and road maintenance. We have a lot of unimproved roads, and the location of our reservation is huge. It's a huge land base. Telecommunications, we lack coverage. We lack the BIA towers, and they're old and outdated. So we have our internet access is limited. Education, schools need facilities upgrade, competitive wages, counselors, and school resource officers. We have very little funding for school resource officers. But our chief of police will be testifying, I believe, tomorrow, and he can cover all that as we submitted our paperwork here, so it covers a lot. Indian country formulas do not work for us. Prioritized tribal allocations also do not work for us. True, meaningful government-to-government consultation and coordination needs to happen. I hear talks of leadership here in Washington, D.C. since I've been in the short time I've been in office. I've heard talks of treaty obligations, and I'm going to be looking forward to that, to having more conversations about that. I've highlighted important issues in our written testimony, like I just said, but you know, but there are many other equally important needs, and it's not fair to prioritize. I feel it's not fair because we're in desperate need of all funding in all departments, programs. With that, let me wrap it up. You know, the Oglala Lakota are resilient. You know, we're a proud people. We're called in culture and spirituality, and that's what keeps us strong. You know, we survived a lot under harsh conditions, and we'll keep going. But we need your help to fulfill your treaty obligation. I urge you to help us fund us at the highest possible level to ensure the money is being fairly distributed to all tribes, keeping in mind the unique challenges of the Great Plains tribes like my tribe, the Oglala Sioux tribe. For us, it's not a policy question, it's life and death. Thank you.
I thank you all for your testimony, and, you know, as I'm sitting here listening to you, and I've been to Pine Ridge several years ago when I was chairman of this committee before, and enjoyed the trip, but also was, I think, amazed at the needs.
Yes.
And we visited other reservations. We went to Standing Rock and to the Cheyenne River Reservation and Lone Pine, and we were down in Oklahoma too and visited those tribes down there. The differences between tribes is great, but I got to tell you, and I think Shelley would probably agree with me, having worked on this committee for years, it will be years before we can honestly say we've met our treaty obligations. I mean, we have been so lax in it over the century that it will be years before we can all stand up and say, you know, we're where we need to be. Our goal here is to move us forward and to continue moving us forward to address just what you said. And I tell people in Idaho all the time that, you know, if you really want to see poverty in America, let's go visit a few reservations, because it is terrible. I saw schools at some of these reservations that I'm not proud to say, but I would not send my child to. But that's what they had. And so it's important that this committee get out and actually see on the ground what works. And I can tell you our visit to the Navajo Reservation was fascinating. It's a beautiful reservation down at Window Rock and other places. We really enjoyed that. And there are challenges there, as you mentioned. And while I know that these funding requests that you've all asked for are significant, our goal is to move us, as I said, in the right direction and not take a step back. Never take a step back. Yes, Frank.
Sir, if I may, you know, I know earlier you mentioned something about stability, and I'd like to add on to your comment there on stability, and that is the ultimate goal of most of the treaty tribes, I should say, is because we lacked we had a formula that wasn't working for us, and that formula they've been using it for decades, and it's slowly choking us out. And all our programs can attest to that, where we had no choice to minimize some of the needs there and prioritize, where it turns into a life and death situation.
Yep.
And right now our police force is filling it.
Yep.
We have 5 to 7 officers a day patrolling, over 51,000 plus membership.
Yeah.
The crime is extremely high, the violence, the drugs, the alcohol. And it's also affecting our families because of lack of funding, resources. Who do we turn to? You know, I look outside our reservations and I see all these organizations helping people overseas out. While you got a third world country right here in America, and we're not even addressing it.
Yep.
Our people suffered a lot. Our people served this country. I'm also a proud veteran, a combat veteran. And now I'm fighting for my people, my tribe, and I'll continue to do that. But I just want to make everybody aware here, it's time that we're heard. We need to be listened to. We're not sitting here begging for help. We are asking you to hold up to your end of the bargain with our treaty obligations, because that has definitely choked us out.
Yep.
Thank you.
I appreciate that, Frank. Ms. Pingree?
Yeah, and thank you so much. Thank you for your service. And as Representative McCollum mentioned, tribal members serve at a much higher rate than the general population, and that too should be considered this complete lack of respect and sufficient funding. And I really appreciated your remarks, and also your comment that when people suggest you prioritize, there's really no way to prioritize, because each of these you're talking about fundamental basic needs that aren't being met. So I hope we can continue to do more and certainly not go in the wrong direction. Congratulations on your new position. I guess you're both fairly new here. And I didn't realize, you brought up a lot of important points, of course, but on the uranium mine cleanup, is there current mining going on the reservation? And also, just on the cleanup point, is that a EPA responsibility that we need to be working on, or how does that impact you?
Currently, uranium mining is banned on the Navajo Nation,
Okay.
and since the mid-2000s. But I also believe that there's no cleanup happening at the moment, and there is EPA involved, but just the lack of actually getting mines cleaned up is the holdup. So definitely, if we want to hold a hearing, maybe a meeting with EPA, we're definitely open to that, to try to figure out how do we streamline that, because I know as of a month ago, there's a school out in Cove Day School. So kids were actually in school over a year ago, and just from the uranium mines and all the water did come down the mountains, and it actually contaminated the school site, so that's halting the BIA construction of the school. So just as of a year ago, kids were actually in that area. So definitely over 500 mines. Whatever we can do to really collectively address that, that'd be great, because I think that the safety and the well-being of our Americans should be a top priority. And that's one of the things that I always like to say, is that we're Americans as well, and also Native Americans, but let's try to work collectively together so that people can feel safe. So.
Absolutely. And if this committee also has jurisdiction on the EPA's budget, so if we can facilitate a meeting like that, we'd be happy to do it. And thank you, Chief Francis. We're also so proud of you in Maine and the work that you do for all of the Maine tribes, particularly in our legislative challenges that we have in Maine, but also with USIT and really representing so many interests out there and supporting that with all of us. I just want to remark that I thought your suggestion that we create a Marshall Plan for the tribes kind of goes along with your suggestion that we just have to at some point step back and take a look at this bigger issue, that we never catch up. We don't come close to meeting our obligations. And while I know the chair is really dedicated to keeping us on track and keeping the funding going, we're just never going to get there if we don't, in a sense, just like we looked at the infrastructure bill for the United States, saying, what do we need to do to have an infusion here to support our obligation, and any other thoughts you have about that, I'd be interested to hear.
Well, USET has really worked over the past few years on this Marshall Plan theory for Indian country and approach. And as we looked at different things, not just post-World War II, but what we see going on in Ukraine and different places, and not saying those decisions were wrong by any means, but just that how can we get to a place where we're having that type of conversation? And so So USET really has developed a step-by-step thought on how to accomplish this. We've put it, I think, some of it in our written testimony, and be happy to provide that to you all as well going forward.
Great, great. Well, I'd really be interested in working on that, so I'll look for it in your written testimony, and I can be in touch about talking about it more.
And it's great to see you, Mr. Zinke. I think the last time I saw you, you were paddling the Penobscot River.
You know, God's got a sense of humor. I'm back.
You can come back to the Penobscot River anytime, Mr. Zinke.
Well, thank you. Mr. Ensley, would you have any comments? Well, thank you for your testimony. I'll look forward to working with you, and good to see new friends and old. I've been in the reservations. There's a lot to do. You know, I up front, I didn't realize how bad the BIA was until I was in charge of it. I get it. You know, at the end of the day, we also need consensus among the nations on what to do. It's complex because it's very difficult. You know, it's hard in Congress to get consensus. The nations and the points that I learned that every nation's different. You know, it's easy to combine and say, well, the Indian issue problem. Well, each nation is a sovereign nation, and they're different. And so, you know, how we go forward, you know, probably to empower the front line. If there's one thing I learned as a SEAL, and thank you for your service, Semper Fi, is that you got to look at the front line. You know, it's how the E5 is you know, what's his conditions in life. You don't learn a lot from the headquarters. You learn when you go to the front line. And more resources in the front line, how we can make sure that resources get there without being caught up in regulation. You know, in Montana, a little different, but, you know, the counties that are adjacent to the reservations, if the counties had the same amount of regulation, they wouldn't put up with it. But the nations have far greater amount of regulatory oversight, problems, and just trying to get to the first base. So I get it, and I look forward. And this is a bipartisan committee. We work with the nations, we work together, but we recognize the issue. So, thank you all. Thank you, gentlemen. Great to see you.
Will be love.
coming. In D.C., as you know, it's interesting. I'm still a Reagan optimist. I still think it's fixable, so it's good. But it's important, here it's important to hear the voice and to identify what we can do. So we look forward to your testimony, and we look forward to working with you on it. And I do remember my given name is Wawanga Intacha, so I do remember, sir. So with that, sir, we'll begin with you, Jeffrey. Jeffrey Stiffarm.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to say I'm sit before you very humbly and to speak about our needs and wants and needs back at Port Balnup in Montana. Thank you for listening to our story. My name is Jeffrey Stiffarm. I'm the president of Port Balnup Indian Community, home of two different tribes, the Nakota Assiniboine tribe and the Aninin, the Gros-Ventre tribe. I'm an enrolled member of the Gros-Ventre tribe, and I've been the president there going on year number 2 here, and so I have a little bit of experience in the political arena, but my career, I was a law enforcement officer all in Port Balnup, and that's kind of what I want to testify on and tell my story about. And you heard a little bit of other stories from other tribes that issues that they had and the problems with public safety and other issues in Indian country. And the things that I wanted to kind of point out is, I was going to throw some numbers at you here real quick. Is in the past, the U.S. government sent over $40 billion in foreign aid to other countries. That's over 10 times greater than they ever spent on anything in Indian country. Afghanistan alone, they sent more money to Afghanistan than they have ever done to Indian tribes in the United States. Something to remember and think about as you guys hand out the funding going forward. And the federal government gave $2.8 billion to farmers and ranchers in this country. They gave the tribes half that. And listening to some of the stories that the people talked about earlier, and their issues, and that's the same issues in Port Balnup. We're not asking for a handout, we're asking for a hand up. We're the first people of this country. Yet we're still treated like second-hand citizens, that always overlooked, always stepped over, always an afterthought, and the issues that we have in Port Balnup, in 1997, Port Balnup 638 contract of the BIA law enforcement. At that time, the base funding for law enforcement was $1.2 million. Here we are in 2023, our base funding is $1.3 million. Now, how can you run a public safety on that amount of money and nothing has increased, but yet the cost of living has probably increased 1,000 times over since '97. At that time, we were funded to hire 10 officers at $10 an hour. We have a reservation of over 600,000 acres. We have 6 officers to cover that. So 1 officer per shift. And in my years and experience in law enforcement, the lack of funding, whether it was in housing, public safety, or IHS, we didn't have an ambulance in the southern end of our reservation. So our officers would have to respond to medical calls and transport with our police units. And I remember transporting people and them dying in my police unit because we couldn't get there in time and we didn't have the medical training. A heart attack. We'd pull over the side of the road, do CPR, things like that. What we're asking for is to help us with the bare necessities of life for our people. Most of the money that this government sends overseas is to help with wars, and that's to help kill people. We're asking for money to help save our people. And it's not a very hard thing to think about when you talk about life. You know, our children are always sent off to foster care. We don't have enough homes. We got 5 families living in one home at Fort Belknap. And I'm sure the other reservations, the other people have the same issues that we do. I know we all do. And the hard times that we have. And like I said, it's the bare necessities that we're asking for to survive and to live on. It's a very hard situation, you know, and I know some of the people that spoke before me said you guys visited the reservations, you know, and I don't know if you guys have been to Montana except my friend here, Mr. Zinke. No, he's been a champion for our people back home, and I want to thank you for that and what you're going to do going forward. And I want to congratulate you again for being elected to take care of us, to help us, and we'll work together with you to do that. And I mean that from the bottom of my heart. And a family from Fort Belknap adopted him because he was their commander of one of our SEALs that was part of his command that was killed. So he had enough compassion to reach out to that family back in Fort Belknap, and he's part of our reservation now, and I want to thank you again, Commander Zinke, from the bottom of my heart. But that's a part of our story that we have, you know, and a lot of our funding that we ask for is not just for law enforcement, it's social services, it's IHS, housing, like I said, the basic necessities that we have that we're trying to live. We got homeless people, you know, people that still live off of, you know, you guys remember them days to hand out rations? A lot of our people still live off of rations, general assistance, because we can't provide jobs, we can't provide income for our people. And it's a hard thing to watch when you're as a cop or when you're a tribal leader now and you watch this, you know, and a lot of our reservations across the country are still fighting for our water, you know, and so is Fort Belknap. And water is another basic necessity that we need in the country, and our fair share. You know, so you can't have the land without the water. Well, we need water too, and we need the money to build infrastructure, irrigate, to grow crops, to feed our cattle, our horses, things like that, to grow our medicines. And I'm a very strong believer in our culture. As you can tell, I'm holding a piece of bark that I hold when I talk and I pray with. That's from our medicine lodge that I danced in. And I asked my relatives that have gone before me to sit here and say the words I'm saying to you. I speak from my heart to every one of you to understand that it's not me speaking, it's the people back home where I come from, that the basic needs that we need, and I have to reiterate the basic needs: public safety, health, housing, court systems, you know, things like that. You know, we really need you guys to really think about that with the money that you guys sent overseas, over $40 billion, and this was a couple years ago. It's probably a lot more now, what you guys are sending over to foreign countries compared to what you're spending on the first people of this country. You know, and I won't take any more of your time, but I want to thank you for your time, for listening, and I hope that you don't listen with your ears, but you listen with your heart to really understand what we're going through, the people. Gonna hear.
Thank you, Mr. President, and Councilmember Langford.
Good morning, Hesquext. My name is Carol Langford, and it's an honor to be in front of this committee today, to be able to speak to you, but especially in front of you, Congressman Zinke, Chairman Zinke. It's a real honor, and I appreciate your service and honor you for that. Thank you very much. My name is Carol Langford. I am a member of the Confederated Salish Kootenai Tribes of the Flathead Nation. The Flathead Reservation was reserved as our permanent homeland under the Hellgate Treaty of 1855 and encompasses over 1.2 million acres in western Montana, situated around the southern half of Flathead Lake, the largest freshwater lake west of the Great Lakes. Our tribes are made up of approximately 8,000 enrolled members, with about 5,000 members living on the reservation. With a total reservation population of approximately 30,000 people, we are the largest minority on our own reservation. The past 3 years have been challenging for us as Native peoples. The COVID pandemic claimed the lives of 3 to 4 times that of other populations in the state of Montana. This disease took from us elders, speakers of our language, and carriers of our beliefs. It swept through our communities despite our tribes working tirelessly to keep our communities safe. But the pandemic taught us a valuable lesson. We learned that if we work together and effectively work towards solutions, we can overcome great challenges. We also learned how important it is for resources to be deployed where they are needed the most. Now we must take what we have learned and apply those lessons to the challenges ahead. We appreciate the opportunity to share our thoughts on addressing these challenges and the subcommittee's commitment to improve the lives of our shared constituents. We face an ever-growing epidemic of untreated mental illness and substance abuse. We also face threats to our homeland, water, forest, and animals from fire and other natural disasters, as well as from invasive species. Our tribal council has endeavored to tackle the challenges head-on. Like the bison, our people have been in a relationship for thousands of years. We must turn into the storm. To that end, our tribal council has resolved to eradicate homelessness, to address and treat mental illness and dependence on drugs and alcohol, to make our forests and fields resilient to fire and other natural disasters, and to prevent the introduction of invasive species that destroy our homeland, private property, and economies. We support full funding for the Indian Health Service. As a self-governance tribe, we have been carrying out all the functions of IHS on our reservation for decades. Local control and otherwise fiscal management have resulted in significant improvements in the delivery of health care services. But our efforts continue to be limited by funding shortfalls. If we have any hope to adequately address mental illness and addiction, we need the necessary resources to do so. We support additional funding for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I am incredibly proud of the essential governmental services carried out by tribal staff under the Self-Governance Compact with the BIA. Our law enforcement officers, wildland firefighters, and social services, for example, make sacrifices every day to protect our people and our homeland. In most cases, they do so for less pay and inadequate resources and with substandard infrastructure. Our reservation was ravaged by wildfire in 2021 fire season. The CSKT Division of Fire, which engages in a full host of fire management activities, was stretched to the breaking point due in part to inadequate infrastructure to support an evolving fire landscape. Lack of available space and facilities to permanent and emergency personnel, the equipment is a problem and has grown exponentially over the past few years as we adapt to changing snowfall patterns and drought conditions. And one area of critical concern for us is that tribal and wildfire fighters providing fire suppression through our 638 contract are not paid equitably in relation to other federal firefighters. We need the tools to pay our firefighters the same as our federal counterparts. Adequate funding for these essential activities is critical as we face the challenges ahead. We appreciate the subcommittee's commitment and partnership with us. On behalf of the Tribal Council of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes, I thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. Miss Ashley Weeks of the Assiniboine Sioux Tribes.
Good morning, Chairman Zinke, Ranking Member Pingree, and remaining members of the subcommittee. My name is Ashley Dupree Weeks. I'm the General Manager of the Assiniboine and Sioux Rural Water Supply System in northeastern Montana. There are 21 employees on the Fort Peck Indian Reservation that operates, maintains, and replaces this vital system that now serves a rural population of 18,000 persons and will serve 32,000 when the design capacity is reached in several future decades. This drinking water system supplies safe, high-quality, and reliable drinking water from the Missouri River. A regional water treatment plant operated by my certified and highly capable staff delivers water through 3,200 miles of pipeline when completed with multiple pumping stations and water storage tanks. The construction of the project is 95% complete within the Fort Peck Indian Reservation and 85% complete in the area that we serve off the reservation known as Dry Prairie. Our non-Indian partners and a very successful part of our project. The United States will invest $375 million in construction to complete the project, and Montana and Dry Prairie will invest an additional non-federal cost share of $47 million. I have the responsibility of operating, maintaining, and replacing the facilities on the reservation with a federal construction value of $239 million. The request we make of the subcommittee for funding in FY 2024 is $4.204 million, or 1.75% of the construction costs, a modest percentage. This is an increase over our FY 2023 funds of $772,000. Our funding in FY 2021 was $3.28 million, so our request this year is nearly 28% higher than 3 years ago. We only requested small increases in FY 2022 and FY 2023, but we now need a significant increase due to several factors I will outline for you. The first is inflation. Reclamation construction cost trends index for our type of construction rose from 505 to 654, or over 29% over the last 3 fiscal years. This is reflective of the type of inflation for operation, maintenance, and replacement. The second, increasing water deliveries with service to more people. Our deliveries of water rose from 795 million gallons to 1.112 billion gallons over the last 3 years, an increase of 40%. Chemical costs at the water treatment plant increased from $407,000 to $607,000, an increase of 50%. Pumping costs increased from $266,000 to $378,000, an increase of 42%. We have also increased the staffing of highly qualified and certified operators for our system to its full potential. Our labor costs in FY 2021 were around $1 million, and the projected cost in this next fiscal 2024 for our current staff is $1.5 million, an increase of 70% due to the increase of manpower, increasing our FTEs from 18 to 21, and an increase in average salaries. FTEs increased by 17%, average salaries increased by 21%, reflecting an increase in certification as well as inflation. Fuel and maintenance costs of vehicles has also increased over the last 3 years by about 16%. Mr. Chairman, the factors I've outlined account for the increase in funding needed for fiscal year 2024. I thank the subcommittee for the continued support of OMR funding for ASRWSS as authorized by Public Law 106-382.
Thank you. And my good friend Chairman of the great Assiniboine and Sioux Tribe, and Mr. Chairman.
Great relationship for the past few years, and I even enjoyed it when you were with BIA. That was a lot of fun.
I'm glad
I come
you
to
did.
see you. Yeah, I know what happened to you. I didn't agree with it, but some people just do things, and I went through the same thing basically, so it's not good. And thank you, Ranking Member, and thank you, Committee Member. Thank you for allowing us to be here today, and I want to thank you for allowing my manager of our water treatment plant give her report, and she does a great job.
Mr. Chairman, like you hire really good people.
I'm Floyd Azure. I'm chairman of Assiniboine Sioux Tribes of the Fort Peck Reservation. Fort Peck Reservation is in northeast Montana, 40 miles west of the North Dakota border and 50 miles south of the Canadian border, with the Missouri River defining its southern border. The reservation encompasses over 2 million acres of land. We have approximately 12,000 enrolled tribal members, with approximately 7,000 tribal members living on our reservation. We have a total reservation population of about 11,000 people. We appreciate the subcommittee's continued commitment to addressing substance abuse and the consequential challenges that arise from this plague. When someone is suffering from addiction, it is not just the person who is impacted, it is the entire family. And for tribal communities, it is the entire tribe. The addictions our people are facing today, in particular meth and heroin, are so much more destructive than alcohol. I am not sure we can survive another generation with our people locked in the grasp of addiction to these drugs. Thus, I would like to take time today to talk about the importance of supporting Indian Health Services and the need to support the Indian Health Services capacity to collect from third-party payers like Medicaid, Medicare, and private insurance. From expanded Medicaid, Montana has allowed the Indian Health Service to actually provide health care rather than Band-Aids, which all too often were prescription painkillers. It is an old story across Indian country that the biggest drug dealer on the reservation is the IHS clinic. This is because the IHS historically did not have the resources to treat serious conditions like torn ACLs, rotator cuff injuries, or even gallbladder disease, because these conditions are not life or limb conditions and would not qualify for PRC contract care. Consequently, the providers who were led to believe that painkillers would be a safe alternative to real care prescribed painkillers. Thus, for a generation, we have had to deal with people who were given pills and became addicts, which led to the destruction of lives, families, and in the end compromised the very foundation of our community and our future. However, since Medicaid expansion and the numbers tell us that people are getting real health care and their quality of life is improving, which means the quality of life of our children is improving. No longer are people being told that they are not sick enough to get quality health care and given a bottle of pills for the pain. Specifically, we have had scores of hip and knee replacements and other orthopedic surgeries, and other preventive and screening health care includes substance abuse treatment. While there is no magic solution to combating the many issues that are caused by drug and alcohol addiction, I am certain that ensuring people have access to quality health care is a big part of this solution. As our people heal, we must work to heal our families, and that is why I'm here again asking for additional funding for our Tribal Social Services Program. Over 35% of our children are in foster care in Montana. They're Indian children. Indian people represent only 10% of the state population. Finally, a key factor in keeping families together and healthy is housing. Our reservation is in dire need of housing. It is masked by the fact that we have families living in overcrowded situations. Thus, when someone is asked, do they have housing, they answer yes. I live with my grandmother. What they do not disclose is that sometimes 4 or 5 other families live in that house, and it's usually a 2 or 3 bedroom home. We need additional housing improvement program funding to be able to meet the low income housing needs for our members. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, we talk a lot about treaty obligations, but there's also an obligation of border security. There's also an obligation to create the economic conditions where people can reach prosperity. So I fully recognize the obligations of treaties, because sovereign nations, it is one nation having a treaty with another nation. So I understand that and respect that. But also the U.S. can do a lot better with our obligations on border and such. With that, Ranking Member, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for your testimony. I thought that was a really good way of describing the issues when you don't have sufficient health care, and the IHS being the biggest drug dealer, and we understand the progression that's happened in so many places where people start with a painkiller. Did the tribes, or did your tribe receive any of the settlement funds with the drug companies? Were you involved in any of that litigation? No. Yes, you are. Yeah, that's interesting. Well, thank you.
The issue with us the drug problem we have is great on our reservation. But the biggest issue I have to deal with is the children that are affected by it. My wife's been a school teacher for 33 years in kindergarten, and she deals with it. And the children that come in have increasingly came in with mental disabilities. And not only that, but this drug problem we have increases the burden on our healthcare, our law enforcement, our correctional, our social services, and that's why we have the majority of our children in social services. We got 97 of them in foster care on our reservation. And they're not on our reservation, they're spread out through the state of Montana.
Right.
But it all stems from the drug abuse that we have. And there, in Montana, there was a representative in Montana that was putting a bill forward to come to Congress and ask to do away with the reservations with the drug problem. But you got to remember that our reservation is in the middle of Montana. So it's not coming from us, it's coming from the state of Montana. And we have to work with the state of Montana. We have been working with the state of Montana. We have a drug task force with the state of Montana, and it extends to the state of Minneapolis and extends to the state of Washington, our ties. And we have been catching people on Burlington Northern, because they have no guidelines on Burlington Northern. Anybody can get on Burlington Northern. We caught one person that was coming from Portland, Oregon, all the way across going to Minneapolis, and they stopped it. They have a stop in Williston, North Dakota. Well, the agents from Williston, North Dakota came in, joined with our agents. We put them on a train in Wolf Point. They pinned the guys down who they were, where they're at in the train, and they took them off the train in Williston, North Dakota. And my people, working with the state of Montana, we work with the Highway Patrol, we work with the County of Roosevelt, we work with the County of Valley County, the city of Wolf Point. We all have the same issue. We don't have enough officers.
Right.
But we've been doing a great job. We've had a bust almost every week. The last bust we had was over 5 pounds of marijuana, over 1.5 kilos of meth, and I don't know how many fentanyl pills in one bust. But that's what's destroying our reservation. And if the state of Montana can't stop them from coming into our state, how are we going to stop them from coming into our reservation?
Yeah, no, and thank you for the good work that you're trying to do, and you're right, it's certainly not just specific to tribal reservations. It's a huge issue in all of our rural communities in a state like mine, too. So, but thank you all for your testimony. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Mr. Elsie, do you have any comments? Thank you. One last, Mr. President, you had mentioned before that you have 5 officers because you had to reduce the number of officers simply to raise the pay, because you get the same amount, you know, over time. 10 years later, you have the same amount. Obviously, inflation, it's hard to recruit when they're so underpaid. But is that true? You had to reduce the number because the budget hasn't the same. You got to hire somebody, and you got to find someone to do the job.
Yes, exactly. We had to reduce our number of officers down to 5 to increase the wages, which the wages still ain't compatible to surrounding areas of the county or highway patrol or anything like that. And we're not cross-deputized. You know, we're the only officers that serve our people back home is tribal officers, 638. And like I said, you know, the starting wages in '97 were $10 an hour. You know, that's minimum wage, you know, to put your life on the line. And that's how when I started in law enforcement, I was at $9 an hour. You know, and people, the surrounding areas, counties, you know, they're offering $30, $40 an hour. You know, like I said, you know, we're a training ground. You know what? The lack of funding throughout Indian country, and it also affects the BIA. You know, and, my years of being a council member, every time I came to DC, I asked BIA for extra funding to increase our base funding for officers' pay, and then give us one-time funding, which was like around $100,000, and you couldn't use it towards wages. You have to use it for equipment or things like that. And that time was a training ground for other agencies. And the BIA told us last year that they're going to increase the BIA police officers' wages because they're a training ground. And I told them, well, welcome to our world. We've been living that from day one. And here you guys are the people that distribute money down to the tribes. You have 638 contracts. You guys got to remember us. You know, you give us pennies on the dollars you get. But then what the BIA and the federal government gives the BIAs, pennies on our dollars to what they give foreign countries and other entities. You know, something to think about going forward at how much money you give other countries compared to what you give to the tribal nations of this country, our first people. But I want to thank you again for this opportunity to allow us to tell our story and the stories you're going to hear after us, and I appreciate every one of you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you all. All right. You gotta love the plane. Well, thank you. I'm honored to be chairman of the next panel, so we'll go right into it. Doctor, we're interested in waiting for your testimony.
Great, thank you, thank you. Uvlalodak. Good morning, Chairman Zinke, Ranking Member Pingree, and honorable members of the Subcommittee on Interior, Environment, and Related Agencies. Uvanga nagayak, Tinakton Sinaga Dr. Pearl Kion Brower. Ukbiagaving miurunga. Kaulirunga Uvanga Ukbiagavik Inupiat Corporation, UIC. Kovesuktunga Mangi Chumingamaga Uvalupak. So good morning. My name is Dr. Pearl Brower, and I am from Utqiagavik, otherwise known as Barrow, on the edge of the Arctic Ocean in Alaska. I live, work, and have the responsibility of caring for our land, the land of the Inupiat, as the president of Ukbiagavik Inupiat Corporation. I'm here to talk to you about the cleanup, or lack thereof, of contaminated lands conveyed to Alaska Native communities as part of the 1971 Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, ANCSA. Specifically, I'm here to testify regarding the need for additional ANCSA contaminated land funding through the Environmental Protection Agencies. Koyanakbak, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to provide our perspective on the impact of contamination in Alaska. UIC is an Alaska Native Village Corporation created under ANCSA, and UIC has worked to become self-sustaining and provide for the economic, social, and cultural prosperity of our shareholders. We celebrate our 50th anniversary this year, and as a company are in the strongest position we've ever been in. As part of ANCSA, the federal government agreed to convey to 12 Alaska Native regional corporations and more than 200 village corporations 44 million acres of land and $962.5 million in settlement of Aboriginal land claims of Alaska Native peoples. However, much of the land conveyed had serious issues with contamination, including PFAS, gasoline and oil spills, metallic debris, and other contaminants. In 1995, Congress directed the Secretary of the Interior to prepare a report on the extent of the contamination. The result was a report to Congress entitled Hazardous Subsistence Contamination of Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act Lands in Alaska. The report acknowledged conveying approximately 650 contaminated sites to Alaska Native corporations with various types of hazardous waste and toxic materials, which pose significant health risks to humans, animals, and the environment, including arsenic, unexploded ordnances, PCBs, among others. Since 2016, there's been very little progress regarding remediation. There are 35 active contaminated sites in Utqiagavik, and UIC itself owns 11 of those sites. Currently, the Navy, according to the Restoration Advisory Board meeting held in October of 2021, was on its third 5-year long-term monitoring review. Today, in 2023, we are in the 21st year of the long-term monitoring, and this year started the fourth fifth-year review. The results from the 5-year review show the absence of an established contaminant degradation rate, and the 2021 trend data make it unclear when this site will achieve cleanup levels via natural attenuation. It is recommended that the annual long-term monitoring program of active zone water continue until cleanup levels are achieved. So basically, essentially, contaminants are not going away naturally. In July of 2017, the Navy conducted surface water sampling at Amicbuck Lake, found PFAS and PFOA was present above the EPA lifetime health advisory, showing that the contaminants are moving into previously clean areas. This lake, used by hunters and animals alike, was transferred to UIC from the military. We as a people are heavily dependent on subsistence resources consisting of migratory birds, caribou, fish, and marine mammals. Our connection to the land and sea which surrounds us is paramount. To sustain our culturally healthy way of life, we must have healthy lands, waters, and animals. It's our cultural belief that taking care of our environment will continue to sustain a healthy way of life, which is why the continued contamination of our land is so harmful. We hunt on land and in the sea because hunting feeds our children and ourselves, but we hunt on contaminated lands and waters. We hike inland on tundra looking for eggs, gathering greens, but we encounter hundreds of barrels left by the federal government while researching Arctic activity decades ago. This contamination seeps into the water we drink and the land from which we feed ourselves and our families. The cleanup is costly, but we cannot put a price on the health of our families. The FY 2023 appropriation bill included $20 million for the inventory, verification, assessment, and remediation of contaminated ANCSA sites. While this is a step in the right direction, $20 million will not cover the remediation of UIC's lands, let alone all of the contaminated sites in Alaska. Therefore, I'm asking the committee to include a larger set-aside for ANCSA contaminated lands in your FY 24 appropriations bill to ensure the efforts to clean our lands can and will be addressed. By mitigating these issues now, we are preventing further problems in the future. I look forward to working with the committee to address the issues of land contaminations in Alaska. Quyunukbuk, thank you so much for your time and the consideration of your testimony, and come and visit us anytime. We certainly are. I was looking, I think I've traveled the furthest. It's good to be here. Got in at 10 o'clock last night.
Yeah. David?
Good morning to you all, representatives of the United States, Chairperson Simpson, Ranking Member Pingree, and members of subcommittee. It is my deep privilege to be here before you today, and I am profoundly honored to speak to you on behalf of my people, the Metlakatla Indian community of the Annette Islands Reserve. Thank you for the opportunity to share our funding priorities for the 2024 federal budget. In 1891, Congress set aside the Annette Islands to create a permanent home for the Tsimshian pioneers of Metlakatla in what was then the colonial territory of Alaska. In doing so, a new trust relationship was born between us. I have traveled a very long way, not quite as long as others, but a long way, to ask Congress to maintain this trust, to keep faith with Metlakatla, to redouble its efforts in our shared commitment to face down every threat, to overcome every obstacle, and build a brighter tomorrow for the next generation. We strongly recommend a substantial increase in baseline funding to the BIA. Year after year, we have large funding shortfalls across all BIA-funded programs, causing services in our community to constantly depend on an inconsistent patchwork of federal funding. We have been forced to choose between meeting water quality standards or providing scholarships to our students. It has sadly become the norm that we don't receive our full yearly appropriation until several months, sometimes longer, after the start of the fiscal year, making it nearly impossible for us to plan, grow, or achieve self-sufficiency. Full advance appropriations for the BIA would lead to better stability, reduce dependence on uncertain grant funding, and improve everything overall. For many years, tribes have requested that IHS be funded on an advance appropriations cycle. Going forward, we urge the subcommittee to take the necessary steps to continue advance appropriations for the IHS for 2025 and beyond. Like many tribal communities, we continue to be impacted by the growing challenge of climate change. The Tongass National Forest, a temperate rainforest, now sees droughts that can last for years, bringing existential threats like water shortages and wildfires closer and closer to our shores. Erosion, landslides, sea level rise, ocean acidification, and changes in seasons all contribute to the serious challenges that my community currently faces. We are forced to reduce emissions, mitigate, and adapt, but to be truly successful, we need additional support, government fundings at levels that are equal to the threat. On top of climate change, our shores have already been invaded by the European green crab, an invasive species that threatens to supplant native crabs, leaving desolation in their wake, most significantly, the potential of destroying salmon populations, which we cannot allow to go unchallenged. Salmon are a keystone species and have shaped the lives of my people for millennia. We are asking the subcommittee to continue increased funding levels for fish hatcheries next year. Our own Tambers Creek hatchery has greatly increased production in recent years, doing our part for the local economy as well as the salmon fishing industry as a whole in Southeast Alaska. In addition to the critical funding needs I've mentioned, the federal trust responsibility does not and should not require that we jump through hoops and compete against other tribes to see that trust services are provided to our people. We support moving away from competitive grants for federal funding mechanisms. We must be granted the flexibility we need to respond to the specific needs of our own community, not those prescribed by federal grants. There is also an invisible threat looming over my people. Our heritage language, Tsimshian, is dying. The Tsimshian language is considered critically endangered. There are only a few dozen speakers remaining in the world. We must impart the grave seriousness of this to every member of this committee. With permanent recurring annual funding as part of our compact, we can, in partnership with Congress, help to save our language, which will ensure a positive identity and future for generations to come. The challenges facing my people are many, but the pioneering spirit of Metlakatla is as strong today as it was when my ancestors first raised the Star-Spangled Banner on that sandy beach on Annette Island in August of 1887. The bravery and patriotism of Metlakatla proudly shows in the faces and records of service of our veterans, as we have the most service members per capita of any city, state, or tribe in America. Metlakatlans have the fortitude to withstand the challenges that face us if Congress will stand with us. We need funding increases, not to become more dependent, but to become more independent. We want nothing more than to enjoy what many of our American Tsimshian warriors fought and died to protect: freedom, freedom from poverty, and freedom to determine for ourselves how our destiny will unfold. So when we recommend increases in baseline funding to IHS and the BIA, we are asking in the context of the trust relationship between Metlakatla and the United States, that once again is built upon the premise of making the Annette Islands our permanent home. I come before this esteemed committee today not to beg for money, but to ask you to invest in Metlakatla's future, that our trust relationship can grow stronger, that together we can create opportunities that will bring prosperity to our whole region, because what is good for Metlakatla is good for Alaska. What is good for Alaska is good for America. I'm Roth Wilsham. Your time and attention has been a blessing. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, David. Cecilia?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Chairman Simpson, Ranking Member Pingree. I greet you with a warm handshake with good feelings from my heart. And I'm one of those people who speaks two languages, Lakota and English. Lakota first and English second. Okay. So I'd like to, and as members of the House Subcommittee on Interior Environment Related Agency, thank you for the opportunity to testify today regarding issues of importance to my tribe, Oglala Sioux. My name is Cecilia Fire Thunder, and I am the president of the Oglala Lakota Nation Education Coalition of 6 schools on the Pine Ridge, and we're pulling in additional schools to help us on this work that we need to do to increase our budgets for our tribal schools. I am also on the Board of Trustees for Oglala Lakota College. Oglala Lakota Nation Education Coalition represents the Oglala Sioux tribe's 6 tribally enrolled controlled schools, tribally controlled grant schools. And so one of the things that we're so happy about is that back around Senator Abrisk, as you know, recently left us. And was because of Senator Abrisk's work, the Senate committee was established many, many years ago. And one of the things that Senator Abrisk did was for PL 93-638 that allowed tribes to take ownership of programs in your community, and so we're part of that, tribally controlled schools. So we have our own school boards, and we administer and run our own schools. So with that, I just wanted to put that out there, okay? Thank you. One of the things, I also want to be a good relative of Indian people, no matter what tribe we come from, look out for each other. So today, I also want to acknowledge not only the 7 schools on the Pine Ridge, but the 183 schools across Indian country that are under the BIE administered education. So we have relatives all over that we need to also look out for. 197 tribally controlled grant schools are the primary provider for education for on-reservation Indian students. Yet schools operating within the BIE system are woefully underfunded, outdated, and dangerous for students and staff. According to the Department of Education in FY 2023, the federal government funded Indian students at roughly half, $6,283, versus what the public schools were getting on my reservation, $12,500. That's like half, okay? This also includes the 9.24% increase from the omnibus bill. I'm also deaf, so you have to forgive me. Sometimes I can't pronounce words very well. Omnibus bill. Did I say it right?
Yep.
Yes.
Thank you. Anyway, so even with the increase, we're still underfunded. So what we wanted to do was to ask for your serious consideration to support our request for the Bureau of Indian Education to increase their budgets for our schools so we can then provide even greater, better services. The ISEP, which is the Indian School Equalization Program funding, so all Indian schools are under ISEP. ISEP dollars are set aside to educate our children. Teacher salaries, books, supplies. Unfortunately, Congressman, what's happening is that because of the underfunding of ISAP and all school operations, including everything else, we're using money out of the money set aside to educate our children to make up for shortfalls in operation and maintenance. Last year, my school, Little Wound School, we spent a little over $300,000 feeding our students. So the USDA under CANS is supposed to also help feed our children. Unfortunately, there's not enough money there. The CANS program only pays for one person in the kitchen, okay? And we have 8 people. So 7 of them we have to pay. So one of the things, and you will be hearing from us on this, on a nutrition bill, a demonstration project that we want to. So we want USDA to fund directly tribal schools. Right now, USDA funds gives the money to the state puts regs on it, and they give it to us. And I'm running out of time here, so I'm just you have my written testimony. However, I also want to talk about our college. Our tribal colleges are like the diamonds on our reservation. The Oglala Lakota College on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation has done some fantastic work in terms of graduating. Our president of the college graduated from our college. She's a PhD. Our schools on Pine Ridge, my school especially, our principals graduated from our high school and went on to get higher education. So one of the things I want to ask you to do is to really give a serious consideration, and as we ask for an increase on our ISEP fundings, and so our schools can provide better services, and most importantly, use the money for education and increase the line items and all the other responsibilities the Bureau of Indian Affairs has. Well, Pilar, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate your testimony. And you know, you mentioned that we spend about half the money on per student on Indian education as we do other students, public school students. Same is true with health services. If you look at the amount of money that is spent per individual on health services versus what is spent outside that versus what is spent for veterans, it's about half of what we spend for patients outside Indian services. And I mean, that's a dichotomy that we've got to address.
Thank you.
Yeah, it really is. You mentioned something else that I agree with, but if you'd explain it, please. You said that treaty obligations, I'll paraphrase, but treaty obligations shouldn't require tribes to compete against one another for grants and stuff.
Yeah.
Explain to me where that comes from. What are the programs that you're competing with other tribes for money for? Because I agree with what you're saying.
Well, and specifically for funding that should be part of the trust obligations anyway.
Right.
Grants very often that they're competitive grants that are for base services in our
So some
in our
tribes are going to
community.
get them and other tribes are not going to get them.
Right, or because of whether it's population or land base, other tribes are favored, ignoring the needs, the specific needs of the given communities that are up for those grants.
Yeah.
And there's not quite enough consideration.
And especially if it's a trust responsibility. If it's a trust responsibility, it is a trust responsibility for all tribes.
Absolutely. Yeah, it shouldn't be one or the other. It
Yeah.
should be everybody.
I appreciate you bringing that up. That's important. Thank you all for being here. Ms. Pingree?
Thank you, and I just want to emphasize that whole point about the per student expenditure. It's just hard to fathom that you could ever do an adequate job with half of the average that we spend in other schools. And I wanted to just sympathize. I come from the coast of Maine, and green crab invasion has been a serious issue for us too. So I guess they're hitting both coasts at the same time. And certainly know the importance of your fisheries to the tribe.
Absolutely, it's crucial to us. Our hatchery's doing fantastic, but we're the first community in Alaska to encounter green crab, and we're pushing the state also for funding and because it's just going to keep spreading. Our neighbors over in Canada and Haida Gwaii have talked their dismay about how out of control it is, and as I mentioned, salmon is a keystone species, and we got to do everything we can to protect it, not just for economic reasons, but the stability of our ecosystem.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. We had I think we had a contest in our state with chefs trying to develop recipes for green crabs, but we are not going to eat our way out of this problem. It's devastating to our shellfish industry, our clams and other things, and the number of contaminated lands and the sites that you're dealing with is really staggering, and I'm sorry that we have not met the obligation. And when Representative McCollum is back, we will remind her that the Navy has funds to do that kind of cleanup, and at the very least, we should be pushing and going after those places where we know the resources are there. I mean, all of this cleanup should be done. It's just unfathomable that we would say, here, look at all this great land we're giving you. Oh, by the way, we didn't clean it up before we turned it over. And then not to fund the cleanup. So I'm supportive of helping you in any way we can. Thank you. Thank you for traveling the distance that you both did.
I gotta be real honest with you. I've never heard of green crabs.
European green crab. I've heard a couple of stories about their origin as to how they made it to the United States. It sounds like there's one strain of it that on the coast that someone purposefully dumped off a boat at some point, and they're smaller than Dungeness. They breed rapidly. They destroy herring and salmon habitat. They eat through everything. It could be. It's to our knowledge so far is that there probably isn't a way to eradicate them. We have to learn how to maintain their population to prevent them from destroying natural wildlife and habitat.
Yeah, I'm very interested in salmon habitat. I've been working on an initiative to restore Idaho's salmon runs that will be extinct if we don't do something about them. And it's amazing how hard it is to do. But the one thing I will tell people whenever they talk to us, I said, every tribe in the Pacific Northwest, every tribe, when they sign treaties, reserve their fishing rights. Those fishing rights, those reserved fishing rights don't mean anything if there's no fish. And especially if there's no fish because of what we've done to destroy those fish habitats. So we got to restore those. But it is controversial, it's costly, but it's got to be done. Or one day you're going to wake up and your children will say, what were you doing when the salmon went extinct in Idaho? And why do they call that the Salmon River? There's no salmon in it, you know?
Well, and I'd just like to add that it's similar, actually, you could talk about funding for language revitalization. Doing something now before it's too late is going to be less expensive.
Exactly.
In many ways than if we just take care of it now.
Yep.
So whether that's salmon or our language, it's a cheaper investment now.
Absolutely.
Than later.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you all for being
Thank
here
you.
today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Abigail Echohawk and Irene Martin. Good morning. I've got Abigail Echohawk first on here, so Urban Indian Health Institute.
Good morning. Thank you so much. The opportunity to speak, Chairperson Simpson, Ranking Member Pingree, and members of the committee. I'd also like to thank the staff who did an incredible job of pulling us all here together. It's always an incredible feat to keep this all going. I'm Abigail Echohawk. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma and the director of the Urban Indian Health Institute, along with the executive vice president of the Seattle Indian Health Board and Urban Indian Health Program in Seattle, Washington. I have had the opportunity to spend a lot of time working to end violence against Indigenous women and all women across this country. 4 years ago, I stood at the Capitol alongside Senator Lisa Murkowski, where we released the very first data report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls that has ever happened in this country. In that data report, what we found is that there was a crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and people. However, what we knew is that there wasn't any data being collected. And our report 4 years ago pointed out this gap. As a direct result of our report, the advocacy of tribal leaders and grassroots advocates, there was legislation passed, Savannah's Act and the Not Invisible Act, along with, I'm very proud to say our report is cited in more than 40 pieces of legislation in states across the country. I self-funded that report with $20,000 I raised out of speaking fees because nobody would fund us to do it, because nobody believed what was happening to our people. And then we proved it. But 4 years has gone by, and what has happened? Unfortunately, we have seen the dismal, non-existent work that the Department of Justice was supposed to do under Savannah's Act and the Not Invisible Act. And I want to share with you what we've done instead. As a result of the Department of Justice not fulfilling their responsibilities under Savannah's Act and the Not Invisible Act, Indian country had to act. My organization, the Urban Indian Health Institute, stepped up to do that because, not because we wanted to, but because we had to, because our people were suffering. We looked at and we found that there was a Government Office of Accountability report that looked at the implementation of Savannah's Act and Not Invisible Act and found that the Department of Justice was lacking. And in fact, it took them more than a year and a half to simply appoint people to a committee to look at this crisis. In the year and a half in which they did that, in a year and a half, I was able to reform an entire law enforcement data department for one of the largest counties in the country, King County, Washington, where we reformed their data, and I was able to train their law enforcement officers and fix the problems that they said couldn't be fixed. All of the things that my team and I are doing are actually in the work of Savannah's Act and the Not Invisible Act. We are doing this with a small amount of funding as a tribal epidemiology center. We are one of 12 tribal epidemiology centers in the country. However, we are drastically underfunded. Yet, despite that drastic underfunding, we continue to do the work that nobody else is doing. I remember when we released that report, I was standing at the Capitol, and a woman from a tribe came up to me, and she said, "Abigail, I buried every single one of my 4 sisters covered in bruises." She said, "We can't keep doing this. We have to keep working." And every time when I step into this work and I realize that despite everything that we're doing, despite all of the work that you have all done to ensure that this legislation passed, we are not seeing the fulfillment of it happening within the administration. They need to be held accountable, and those of us who are doing the work need to receive the funding that we desperately need to do so. I have done and volunteered more than my team and I have done more than 2,000 hours of unpaid work in this 4 years. Along with right now, I'm actually funding the state of Hawaii, who passed legislation to address missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and do a data report, but they didn't give them any money. So I raised $100,000 and I'm currently funding the work in the state of Hawaii because our women matter that much.
Let me interrupt you for just a second. I'm sorry. Would that funding that you're requesting come out of the Department of Justice? Is that where it should be funded or whatever? Or out of this budget?
So we are asking for $474 million for a line item for the Tribal Epidemiology Centers, which is the work. The Tribal Epidemiology Centers work across tribal nations. The 11 represent every tribal nation within the IHS regions. And the Urban Indian Health Institute works with the urban Indian population, which is more than 70% of our population. And so that line item for $474 million would be under IHS.
Okay.
Am I willing to take DOJ money? Yes.
Okay, you continue. Sorry about that.
Well, I'm tired of talking about what I can do with so little. What we're looking for is parity. And I'll close with a story. I was working with a group of young women who had been kidnapped, incarcerated, trafficked. They were forcibly injected with heroin and other types of drugs. They had been recovered, and a tribal community was bringing them together. They were working to bring healing to them. They were using their traditional value systems. Everything every tribal leader here have been talking about: connection to land, connection to culture, resources within the Indian Health Service, which is why we need mandatory advance appropriations. And I was sitting there with those young women, and I was sharing with them my own story. I'm a survivor of sexual assault and of rape that was never prosecuted as a result of being an Indian person on Indian land. And I told them the story of the blueberry. And a blueberry in my tribal community in Alaska, where I was born and raised, it teaches us so many things. It teaches us how to survive in the greatest cold and the most heat. It has the most nutrients. It teaches us how to go out and gather. It tells us that we can survive despite all obstacles. I shared that with those young women. About a year later, I was at another conference. A young woman comes up and she runs up to me and she gives me the biggest hug. And she grabbed me and she said, "Abigail, I want you to know that today I'm a blueberry." She's like, "I can survive. I can make it. And I didn't think I could. But I'm a blueberry because I'm learning my language. I'm connected to my land again. I'm incorporated in my communities. I'm with my elders." She said, "Abigail, I can be a blueberry too." And so today I challenge you to think about what it means for all of you to step into that same place. Hold DOJ accountable, get the resources to Indian country and law enforcement on tribal lands in urban Indian areas, to the Tribal Epidemiology Centers and to the Indian Health Service appropriately in fulfilling treaty and trust responsibility, because you're part of our story too. And when I go again and I see that young woman, because now this young woman's about to graduate college. She's going to be stepping into these spaces and places and advocating for her people, and we're going to work to ensure, and that's the kind of healing we're bringing. When we bring our cultural value systems in, when we fight for our people, we will see the healing, because opiates, substance misuse, health disparities are all grounded in trauma. And until we address the root cause of that, we're going to be sitting at these tables for decades. I don't want to sit at this table. I want to talk about healing, and I want to be a blueberry along with all of you.
Thank you, Abigail. And if anybody wants to, I'll let her go on because I interrupted her. Irene?
Well, that's a tough act to follow. Well, bonjour, good morning. Chairman Simpson, Ranking Member Pingree, and Mr. Elsie. My name is Aureen Martin, and I am a citizen of the Bad River Band of Ojibwe in Wisconsin, and I'm also on the Board of Directors for the National Indian Child Welfare Association. NICWA is a national American Indian Alaska Native organization with nearly 40 years of experience in policy development focused on Native children and families. Our mission is twofold. First, it's to address issues of child abuse and neglect through training, research, policy, and community development. And two, to support compliance with the Indian Child Welfare Act. And that's really my connection. I'm an adoptive mom of 2 Native children, and I practiced Indian Child Welfare Act law when I was a practicing attorney. But today I'm here to talk about BIA programs serving Native children and families. And before I go into my comments, I do want to thank the committee. I want to thank you personally for what you've done in the last few years on child welfare programs. You've created some increases that have been extremely helpful, and we do appreciate that. But your support for these programs is extremely important because Native children are placed in foster care at a rate higher than that of the general population. In some states, it's 10 times higher than the general population. Yet tribal governments have some of the most limited access to federal child welfare funding. In many cases, they don't have any direct access and they have to access funding through states. We know, and studies have shown, that the surest way to reduce the flow of Native children into the child welfare system is to ensure that tribes have full capacity to protect their children and families, whether they're at home or in state care. Accordingly, we make the following recommendations. First, we recommend that Indian Child Protection and Family Violence Prevention Act grant programs, get it wrong every time, be fully funded at $90 million. These two grant programs remain our highest priority. The law creating these programs was enacted in 1990 to address the lack of reporting, investigation, treatment, and prevention of child abuse in Indian country. The act was very successful in improving the reporting of abuse because it created mandatory reporting requirements for children, for people to have regular contact with Native children. It also created the background check system for foster families. But the unique provisions of the act authorizing direct funding for child abuse prevention and treatment for Native families was only funded last year by this committee in an amount of $1 million. We request this program be funded fully every year, but we hope you consider any increase because we know that any access to this program will be groundbreaking. The other priority recommendation I'd like to make with you is to increase funding for the ICWA on-reservation program and off-reservation program, changing on-reservation from $17.8 million to $30 million and increasing the urban program from $1.5 to $5 million. The BIA ICWA program provides dedicated funds for tribes to provide their own child welfare services, both to children living on and off the reservation. But even though tribal child welfare programs work with some of the most at-risk and needy families in America, they have access to fewer resources than their state counterparts. Although almost every tribe receives ICWA funding from BIA, almost 2/3 of tribes receive less than $30,000. This $30,000 is expected to support a wide array of essential child welfare services, including child protective services, family reunification and rehabilitation, case management, foster care, recruitment and retention, and adoption services. And that's not even enough to fund one full-time position. The same services are provided by ICWA off-reservation programs, usually through urban programs, but the funding is even more scarce. We know that Native children living outside of their communities face bigger challenges because they have a harder time connecting with their culture, communities, and kinship networks. These services are crucial as the 2020 census indicated that nearly 87% of all individuals who identified as Native lived off-reservation, up from 67% in 2010. And 60% of individuals live in metropolitan areas, making urban programs vitally important to the tribal child welfare system. We are so grateful that you appropriated $1.5 million last year, a $500,000 increase in this program, and we're hoping that you'll consider bigger increases for this year. In conclusion, I'd like to note that the statistics tell us that both Native population and the number of Indian families involved in the child welfare system has been increasing for a number of years. We also know that prevention, early intervention, and treatment of childhood trauma saves lives, but it also saves money because children who experience violence are more likely to have problems and enter the system. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you both for testifying. You don't even want to get me started on this. This is a huge problem. The abuse of Native American women in this country is horrendous. They've just started making some TV movies about it. I think that has raised the public's attention to this. But I grew up, the southern border of my town was the Fort Hall Indian Reservation. I went to school with a lot of kids. I saw the abuse that Indian children took and stuff. Not just on the reservation, but the abuse they took at school. This is, to me, almost the largest problem that's got to be addressed. I mean, there are other things. Yes, we need new buildings for schools. We need, you know, we can go on and on. This can't happen in this country. we can't allow it to happen. So I appreciate everything that you all have done and are doing to try to address this problem.
Thank you so much. And I did a study that was released in 2018 that actually showed, it was a study in Seattle, Washington, where of the Native women we talked to, 94% of them have been raped or coerced into sex in their lifetime. In addition to that, one of the things we found is that they were more likely to have broken bones and large amounts of broken teeth, which is not actually the same when you look at other populations.
Yeah.
And so my staff and I, when we were thinking about that, it's like we could think about it as people beat us more, or we're fighting back harder.
Yeah.
So we really want to see that strength-based things we've been working with, and for us at the Seattle Indian Health Board, we have a full dental program. But we also, I've been working with the folks at the American Dental Association to think about what pro bono work looks like. And unfortunately, because of the underfunding of the Indian Health Service, because we need mandatory advance appropriations, our programs don't always have what we need to truly do some of the basic things, cosmetic dentistry for somebody's teeth who are all broken out because they were beaten. You know, those are the necessary things our people need, and we deserve that. That is a basic dignity, let alone now we need to have the mental health resources to address the problem at the root cause.
Yeah.
And so again, mandatory advance appropriations for the Indian Health Service is absolutely key.
Having been a dentist in the real world, I know exactly what you're talking about. And of course, you don't have the same challenge in the urban Indian Health Services, and that there are actually dentists within, miles of where you are. But when you're out on a reservation, Pine Ridge or something, how do you get a dentist to go out there? How do you get a dentist to live there, or a physician, or something else? There are so many challenges, but I will tell you, and I mean this from the heart, we cannot in this country allow what is 94%
Yes.
of the
Yeah.
women have been raped.
And the study that I did in Seattle, Washington, yes. And I do want to say for the urban Indian health programs, as funded through a contract through the Indian Health Service, we do receive less than 2% of the overall IHS budget. We do struggle with getting dentists within our programs. And while there are dentists, for example, outside of our agencies, our folks, because of the socioeconomic deprivation that they experience, don't have the resources to access those services. So it is still an incredible gap, and one that we are always addressing across the urban Indian health programs.
Well, I'd be more than happy to work with you with the ADA, because I have a
love
close
that.
association with them, and see what we can do about pro bono. We can find dentists that do pro bono work that are willing to do that.
I would
and stuff,
really
so.
appreciate that, and so would our women.
You bet. Ms. Pingree.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I really appreciate your strong commitment to dealing with this. And thank you so much for your commitment and the amazing work you've done, and really your personal commitment of raising money, that you should never have to be in that position, but then we shouldn't have so much neglect of this problem. And I would be fully committed to doing anything we can to make sure that the Justice Department, we're a small committee, and we should budget everything we possibly can to meet the requests that you've mentioned, but also we got to make sure that the Justice Department and this administration is doing their job, because it is a just staggering issue that we're still dealing with this. And
I can see some joint letters coming up.
I can see so, yeah.
We'd love to work with
Put
you
our
on
foot
those.
down on that. So yeah, we'd love to have your guidance on that, and really thank you again for your work and your support. And I'm just anxious to work with you in any way we can. And of course, you two are dealing with two really, really critical, heartbreaking problems. The issues of women and the issues of children, and so many of these issues that you brought up are being underaddressed. And I just can't even imagine when you said that almost 2/3 of the tribe received $30,000, and then the list that you made of all the things that have to be done with that money, that's just, that just doesn't even come close to being a drop in the bucket to what is needed. So I hope we can continue to do more. Thank you both, really, for the work you do.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Elsey?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. This is my first hearing. I'm new to this subcommittee. I'm grateful to be on it. I waited to listen until I heard all morning's testimony, and a lot of folks have gone on the problem that faces our tribal nations. I am a husband, father, warrior, and protector, Navy 20 years. I live in Texas. I don't have any tribal tribes in my district. But what I've heard this morning is that we need to break the cycle of hopelessness and dependence that has existed for so long. And as we talk about kids, when as a naval aviator, there is not one thing that occurs to end up in a mishap. It is a chain of things. We call it the Swiss cheese model, and everything has to line up to have the end result being that mishap. And if you block one of those holes in the Swiss cheese, you can affect mission success instead of mission failure. And so what I've heard this morning is we have a failure of education, employment, addiction, abuse of women, crime, housing, health care, and inflation. And we have to start with stopping one of those issues going forward. It seems like from where I sit, the easiest, nothing's easy. The most direct one is safe communities with adequate law enforcement based on full frickin' treaty adherence to getting the law enforcement that you deserve. And as it's very hard not to get emotional, and as I think you said, don't even get me started. Yeah. As a warrior and protector, and your staggering numbers, and of course, as you mentioned, it's in pop culture now, but now that I'm a part of this committee, I'd like to learn more. You've talked about the victims. Who are the serial perpetrators of these crimes over and over and over again? Can you answer that in 1 minute or less?
Yes. So we actually find that a majority of the perpetrators are white men who have identified, particularly in reservation areas, the opportunity to exploit a maze of jurisdiction where they are not prosecuted. So the things that are happening under the Violence Against Women Act, the expansion of tribal authorities is absolutely essential and needs to continue to grow and have further funding associated with that. And we also need to be holding law enforcement accountable that is outside of the reservations in doing that. And again, when we talk about it being hopelessness within our reservations, I would say this room here is full of hope, because when we have the full fulfillment of our treaty and trust responsibility, we have the ability to stand up for our people, and our culture, community, and commitment to each other is what continues to give us hope despite overwhelming obstacles.
Thank you for that answer. It's staggering, and I look forward to supporting it any way I can and as you said, there's always hope. So I look forward to being a part of that solution on this subcommittee. Thank you for your testimony, everybody's testimony this morning. Thank you for your time. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, one of the things that really is eye-opening is to go visit our Indian brothers and sisters on their terms, on their land, and see what's actually going on the ground and stuff. And we started that a few years ago. I think we were the first committee when I was chairman that went out to Oklahoma and South Dakota and a few other places, and then other chairmen have followed up. We couldn't do it the last couple of years because of COVID and all that kind of stuff, but we're going to continue that. And we certainly invite anyone that wants to go along, and we'll decide which areas we're going to go this year. We want to go to someplace we haven't been yet, and because I think it's important not only that you come and talk to us as you are today, but we come and talk to you out on your reservations and your places of living and stuff about the challenges you're facing there. So I thank you for your testimony today very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. That concludes the morning session. We will begin again at 1 p.m. Committee is adjourned for an hour.